Of the 19th century, England was experiencing an influx of Irish immigrants flooding major cities, including the East End. Since 1882, many Jews from Eastern Europe and Russia have settled in the same area. The communities of the English East End were extremely overpopulated. The number of inhabitants was increasing, which led to a deterioration of working and living conditions. Robberies, violence, and alcohol abuse have become a hallmark of life in overpopulated areas. Widespread poverty has forced many women into prostitution. In October 1888 year, the City of London Police Department revealed that more than 1,200 prostitutes work in the city and 62 brothels function. The decline in the economy has influenced the development of various social trends. In the period from 1886 to 1889 years, England was rocked by a wave of public demonstrations in which the city authorities had to intervene. Racism, high crime, and extreme poverty. That's what characterizes the Whitechapel of that time. It is not surprising that it was at such an alarming time that the public was shocked by a series of incredibly brutal murders that were attributed to serial killer Jack the Ripper. At the end of the Victorian era, Whitechapel gained fame as the most famous criminal slums in London. The area around Flowery Dean Street was described as possibly the most dangerous and most obscene street in the entire metropolis. Dorset Street has been called the worst street in London. Assistant Commissioner of Police Robert Anderson recommended Whitechapel to those who are interested in dangerous classes as one of the main London criminal places. Robberies and violence were commonplace in Whitechapel. The area was characterized by extreme poverty, vagrancy, drunkenness, and rampant prostitution. The focus of all these factors was public housing, which became an inexpensive haven for the desperate and destitute, such as the victim of the Whitechapel murder. All of the identified victims lived in the heart of the slum. In Spitalfield, 3 on George Street, 2 on Dorset Street, 2 on Flower and Dean Streets, and 1 on Roll Street. Police work and criminal prosecution were largely based on confessions, witness statements, and the detention of those guilty of committing a crime, or possession of suspects, obvious physical evidence that clearly linked them to the crime. Forensic methods, such as fingerprint analysis, were not used at that time. The London police services were divided, and are still divided, into the Metropolitan Police Service, which had jurisdiction over most of the urban area, and the City of London Police, which was responsible for order, at a distance of about a square mile, that is, to as many as 9/10 of square kilometers from the center of London. The Minister of the Interior of Great Britain, the chief minister in the government, controlled the Metropolitan Police Service, and the Corporation of the City of London City Police Constables regularly covered rounds, each along a route allocated to him. 11 Whitechapel deaths in 1888 and 1891 were collected into one file, referred to in police files as the Whitechapel murder. Much of the original material was stolen or destroyed. The first victim in the Whitechapel murder series is believed to be Emma Elizabeth Smith. She is also considered to be the first victim of Jack the Ripper. Very little is known about Smith's life. Many police documents collected during the investigation were lost. It is known that she was born approximately in 1843 year, since at the time of her death, she was 45 years old. She had a height of about 157–158 centimeters, light brown hair, fair complexion, and a scar on the right temple. Emma Elizabeth claimed to be a country girl and had apparently not been home for about 10 years or more. In the surviving records, Inspector Edmund Reith, who investigated the Smith case, wrote that she was a widow, and she had a son and a daughter who lived in the Finsbury Park area. Smith herself spent the last 18 months of her life renting a 4-penny bed in a flop house at 18 George Street in Spitalfield, in the heart of the Whitechapel slums, where extreme poverty, vagrancy, drunkenness, and rampant prostitution flourished. Other guests of the house noted that Smith left the flophouse at about 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening and returned at different times, usually drunk. Obviously, alcoholism had a bad effect on Emma Elizabeth's behavior. The caretaker of the flophouse at 18 George Street, Mrs. Mary Russell, said she had known Smith for about 2 years. And when she was drinking, she behaved like a madwoman. In addition, according to Russell, Emma Elizabeth often returned home with bruises under her eyes, which were awarded to her by clients. And once she even claimed that she was thrown out of the window. Detective Walter Dew later wrote in his autobiography about Smith, Emma, a woman in her early 40s, had a mystery. Her past was a closed book, even for her closest friends. All she ever told about herself was that she was a widow who had lost her husband more than 10 years ago, and renounced all her previous attachments. There was something about Emmy Smith that suggested there was a time when she lived a comfortable life. There was a certain culture in the manner of speech, unusual for her class. When Emma was once asked why she had completely abandoned her old life, she replied with a slight wistfulness, "They don't understand any more now than they did then. I have to live somehow." Monday, April 2nd, 1888, was a bank holiday day. Smith left her room in George Street around 7 o'clock that evening and spent most of the evening in Whitechapel High Street, and to the east of it in search of customers 15 minutes after midnight on the 3rd of April on Easter Day. Smith was seen by another lodger from George Street, Mary Hayes. According to Hayes, at the corner of Farrance Street and Barda Road in the Limehouse district, Emma Elizabeth was talking to a man of medium height, dressed in a dark suit with a white silk neckerchief. In the future, this man was not considered a suspect and was not considered to be involved in the subsequent events that occurred with Sam Elizabeth on April 3rd. It is noteworthy that a few minutes before Smith was seen with that man, Mary Hayes herself was attacked. 2 men stopped her, and when one of them asked her what time it was, the other hit Hayes in the face, after which both fled. After that, Hayes saw Smith and a man leaving the area where there was some hard work that night. Mary also told the investigation that Emma Elizabeth had already been attacked. Shortly before Christmas 1887th year, several men beat her, and she spent 2 weeks in the infirmary. Further events were established from the words of Smith herself. She was coming home at about 1:30 in the morning, and she had just passed the church of St. Mary Whitechapel when she noticed that 3 men were walking towards her. To avoid meeting them, Emma Elizabeth crossed the road in the hope that the men would follow their own path. However, they followed her and in front of number 10 Brick Lane, about 300 yards from George Street, attacked Smith, robbed and beat her. Between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, Emma Elizabeth reached her flophouse. At the same time, the investigation reports say that Smith reached the flophouse only between 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning, which could indicate the severity of the wounds, because of which the woman overcame 300 yards for several hours. In the flophouse, Emma Elizabeth ran into 2 lodgers, Mary Hayes and Annie Lee, as well as the caretaker Mary Russell. Lee and Russell saw that Smith's face was bleeding and her right ear was cut off. Smith also complained of pain in her lower abdomen, and the caretaker of the flophouse, Mary Russell, decided, together with Annie Lee, to accompany Emma Elizabeth to the London Hospital on Whitechapel Road, about half a mile from the flophouse. According to witnesses, Emma Elizabeth reluctantly went to the hospital because, like the locals, they were afraid of her. An intern of the hospital, Frederick Travers, who worked there in 1888th year. We speak of this anathema. The poor hated her. They were afraid of it, considered it, first of all, as a place where people died. It was difficult to get the patient to enter the ward. They were afraid of operations for a clear reason, because the operation was a dubious matter. There were stories that happened in the hospital, and it was impossible to say that some of these stories were not true. The women managed to walk half a mile to the hospital when Smith pointed out a place close to the Taylor brothers' cocoa factory and cocoa, where she was attacked. Mary Russell told police that Smith didn't seem to want to go into details. Russell believed that this was due to the fact that Emma Elizabeth was in great pain. But Inspector Edmund Reed noted in his report that she would have passed several guards on the way. But no one was informed about the incident and did not receive a request for help. Perhaps Smith's reluctance to involve the police arose from the fact that she knew the attackers, and knew that she would be avenged if she reported anything to the police. However, Emma Elizabeth said that she was attacked by 3 men, the youngest of whom was only about 18 or 19 years old. At the hospital, Smith was examined by Surgeon George Heslip, who concluded that, among other injuries, the victim of the attack had a damaged peritoneum due to the fact that a blunt object, presumably a stick, was inserted into her vagina during the beating. The doctor assumed that Smith was drunk, but this was not the case, and Emma Elizabeth fully understood what was happening. Smith received medical attention, but the treatment did not help. Emma Elizabeth developed peritonitis. She fell into a coma and then died at 9 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday, April 4, 1888. The investigation was launched on the 7th of April, as the police were informed about the incident only a day earlier. The case was handled by East Middlesex coroner Edwin Baxter, who also investigated the deaths of the next 6 victims. A local police inspector, John West, was assigned to help him. On the 7th of April, the police visited the hospital and came to the conclusion that the death of Emma Elizabeth occurred as a result of premeditated murder. The case was later handed over to Metropolitan Police Service Inspector Edmund Reed, who served in the Whitechapel Police Department. He noted that the victim's clothes were so dirty and torn that it was impossible to determine whether it was a consequence of the attack. Further investigation revealed only that Smith was assaulted by a person or group of persons, resulting in death. The perpetrators were never found, and no arrests were made. Walter Dew, a detective constable from the same department as Reith, later described the investigation as follows. As with all murder cases in this country, no matter how poor and helpless the victims are, the police are making every effort to track down the attacker of Emma Smith. In search of clues, all possible and impossible places were examined. Hundreds of people were interviewed. Soldiers from the Tower of London patrolling the streets were interrogated. The ships in the docks were searched, and the sailors were interviewed. Of all the investigators involved in the Jack the Ripper case, only Walter Dew believed that Emma Elizabeth was the victim of a Whitechapel maniac. In his autobiography, Dew wrote, "I have always believed that Emma Smith was the first to meet death at the hands of Jack the Ripper. But the memories of some details of the incident with Smith were incorrect, and it is quite clear that Emma Elizabeth was the victim of a brutal attack by several men, allegedly gang, engaged in robberies on Old Nicole Street. Prostitutes were often under the rule of gangs, and Smith could be attacked by her pimps as punishment for disobeying them, or as intimidation on their part. However, it was Smith's murder that marked the beginning of the White Murder Police file. It remained open until the investigation into the murder of Francis Cole. In February 1891 was completed. The murders attributed to Jack the Ripper were united, but not all the murders were the work of his hands. In addition, there are disagreements about which crimes were committed by the Ripper. However, Emma Elizabeth Smith was a clear victim of a brutal attack, one of several that occurred that night on the streets of the city. The investigation concluded that the murder of Emma Elizabeth Smith was unlikely to be connected with the subsequent ones. Mary Hayes was interviewed about the attack on her that night, and police assumed that both Hayes and Smith had run into gangs, although no police officer seemed to mention gang activity at that time. Moreover, none of the guards in the area heard or saw anything, and it was said on the streets that it was quiet at that time. Some of the gangs had settled in Whitechapel, but were pickpocketing in other areas. There were also fighting gangs, such as the Green Gate, who were involved in the Batman Green riots at the end of 1881, and in 1882 beat Frederick Hurrah to death. Another gang was the Nicole Street Gang, who was suspected of involvement in the murder of Emma Elizabeth, who came from a narrow circle of people numbering about 6,000 people who lived in a squalid area, bounded by High Street, Shores Game, Hackney Road to the north, and Spitfield to the south. The gang from Old Nicole Street was engaged in both pimping and street robbery, as well as piracy and extortion. Hooligan thugs, they dominated the East End for years. It is unclear whether Emma Elizabeth Smith was a victim of the gang. Could her desire to cross the road to avoid being attacked indicate that she knew who the three men were? Or could they just seem threatening to her? Her silence about the attackers may have been caused by fear of retribution or the fact that she did not pay attention to the appearance of the men during the attack. Most likely, Emma Elizabeth just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The next victim of the Whitechapel murders was Martha. Martha was born in Southwark in the London borough of the same name, on the 10th of May 1849 year, and was the youngest of 5 children in the family of warehouse owner Charles Samuel White and Elizabeth Dowsett. In addition to Martha herself, the family had 2 sons, Henry and Stephen, and 2 daughters, Esther and Mary Ann. In May 1865, Charles Samuel and Elizabeth divorced, and a year and a half later, Martha's father died suddenly. Martha got together with the foreman of packers at Henry's furniture warehouse with Samuel Tebram, and married him on December 25, 1869 year. In 1871 year, the couple moved into a house located next to the house where Martha spent her childhood. The couple had 2 sons, Frederick John in February 1871, Charles Henry in December 1800. The marriage was not happy because of the addiction to alcohol, which caused severe seizures. In 1875 year, Henry Samuel left his wife. For about 3 years, he paid Martha an allowance of 12 shillings a week. Then he cut it down to 2 shillings and sixpence when he found out she was living with another man. After parting with her husband, Martha had a roommate, carpenter Henry Turner, with whom she converged, then diverged, starting in 1876 year. These relationships were also complicated by Martha's alcoholism, which from time to time she found herself on the street. Together with her sons, she turned out to be the Whitechapel Union in Thomas Street for 1881 year. By 1888 year, Turner had no regular work, and Martha had to sell all sorts of trinkets on the streets with him, as well as engage in prostitution. At this time, for about 4 months, they lived near Commercial Road, Whitechapel, around the beginning of July. They moved out of this housing due to high rent and finally broke up. Martha moved into a flop house at 19 George Street, in the heart of the slums of Spitfield, the night before the murder, from the 6th to the 7th of August. Martha spent in the Angel and Crown pub with another prostitute, Mary Ann Connolly, and 2 soldiers. Around 23:45, Martha broke up with a friend and went with a client to the George Art Building, 37 building of a former weaving factory converted into housing for rent. In the middle of the night, a resident of the building, Mrs. Hewitt, was woken up by the scream of murder. However, violence and similar screams were common here, and the woman did not pay attention. At 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 other guests, the Mahoneys, were returning home, but they found nothing suspicious. At the same time, Constable Thomas Barrett, who was patrolling the neighborhood, interviewed a grenadier looming nearby, who replied, that he was waiting for a friend who had left with the girl. At 3:30 in the morning, Albert George Crow, a guest, was returning home after a night's work as a cabman. A cabman is called a hired horse-drawn carriage. He noticed Martha Tabram lying on the second flight of stairs. The playground was dimly lit, and Crow mistook the timber for a sleeping tramp. At 4:45 in the morning, another guest, dockworker John Sanders Reeves, descending the stairs on his way to work, found the body of Tabram. By this time it was light enough, and Reeves saw that the woman was lying on her back in a pool of blood. The victim's clothes were torn and her legs were spread apart, which led Reeves to believe that the woman had been abused. Reeves ran outside, found Constable Barrett, and told him about his horrific discovery. Reeves and Barrett returned to George Yard Buildings. Barrett sent for Dr. Timothy Robert Kellen to examine the body. Kellen arrived at 5:30 in the morning and found out that at that time Martha had already been dead for about 3 hours. Therefore, the murder took place between 2 o'clock in the morning and 3:30 in the morning. During this period, the guests did not hear anything. Kellen found out that the killer inflicted 39 stab wounds with timber, including 9 blows to the throat. 5 in the left lung area, 2 in the right lung area, 1 in the heart area, 5 in the liver area, 2 in the spleen area, and 6 in the stomach area. There were also injuries to the lower abdomen and genitals. The body was lying on its back, and the clothes were pulled up to the middle, exposing the lower half of the torso, which indicated a sexual subtext of the crime. Killeen ordered the body to be sent to the Old Montague Street morgue for an autopsy. However, the doctor could not find any signs of sexual intercourse. The investigation was launched on the 7th of August and entrusted to the inspector of the Metropolitan Police Service, Edmund Reed, who served in the department, Whitechapel, and investigating the early case of the first victim of the Whitechapel murders, Emma Elizabeth Smith. Constable Barrett, who played a greater role in the investigation than the officer who was first on the scene usually played, informed Reed about the grenadier whom he interviewed around 2 o'clock in the morning. According to Barrett's approximate description, the grenadier was about 22-26 years old. He was 5 feet 9 or 10 inches tall, light-skinned, dark-haired, with a dark brown mustache, the ends of which were twisted up. On the 7th of August, Constable Barrett, on behalf of Reed, went to the tower to try to find that grenadier. Barrett, who remembered the man poorly, did not recognize any of the soldiers shown to him at first. Then he recognized one man, but then changed his mind. The refusal of the initial choice, according to Barrett, was due to the fact that the man was wearing medals, while the grenadier, stopped by a constable near the murder scene, did not have them. The second suspect, John Leary, said that he and his friend Anton Lowe had been drinking in Billingsgate, Brixton, at night. Lowe confirmed Leary's words, and both of them were excluded from the list of suspects. Another soldier, Corporal Benjamin, left the barracks on the night of the murder without permission, but it later turned out that he was visiting his father in Kingston. Prostitute Mary Ann Connolly initially did not want to cooperate with the authorities and hid in her cousin's house near Drury Lane, until the police raided here on August 9th. On August 13th, Connolly was taken to the tower, where she could not identify among the grenadiers the customers whom Anna and Timber served that night. She claimed that those soldiers were wearing white bandages worn by the Coldstream Guards and not the grenadiers on August 15th. Connolly was taken to Wellington Barracks, where she pointed out 2 soldiers. Both had solid alibis. The first was at home with his wife, and the second did not leave the barracks on the night of the murder. Formally, the body of Martha Tabram was identified on August 14th, 1888, by her husband. At the time of her death, she was wearing a black hood, a long black jacket, a dark green skirt, a brown petticoat, and stockings, as well as worn spring boots. She was a brunette, about 160 centimeters tall. Like Emma Elizabeth Smith, the investigation has reached a dead end. On August 23rd, the Deputy Coroner of Southeast Middlesex, George Collier, closed the case by announcing that Martha was killed by an unknown person or group of people. None of the suspects in the Tebram case has been arrested. Newspaper articles published in early September of 1888 linked the murder to the earlier murder of Smith on April 4th, and the later murder of Nichols. Before her death, she had 2 or 3. Murder is a Chapman event, that is, the murder of Straight Edis in September and Kelly in November. The press with murder victims are considered canonical victims of Jack the Ripper. All the women were stabbed. As victims, the criminal chose impoverished prostitutes from Whitechapel. Crimes were committed, as a rule, at night in the early morning in public places, on weekends or holidays, or immediately after them. The Timber murder, like the Smith murder, occurred the day after the end of the bank holiday. The police were unable to link the Timber murder to the Smith murder, however. They contacted the subsequent 5 canonical Jack the Ripper murders. Later studies of canonical murders excluded Tebram from the Ripper's victims, since her throat was not cut, which was a kind of visiting card of the Whitechapel maniac. This point of view was put forward by Sir Melville Macnaghten, Assistant Chief Constable of the Criminal Investigation Service of the Metropolitan Police, who suggested in a memorandum on the murders in 1894 was killed by an unknown soldier by soldiers. Dr. Kellen, who conducted a postmortem examination, was convinced that 2 types of weapons were used, and one of them, probably longer and stronger, inflicted a rather deep wound in the chest area, damaging even the bone, while the other wounds were most likely inflicted with a thin knife. Other researchers believed that Martha Tebram was a victim of Jack the Ripper. This version refutes Macnaghten's version on the grounds that he began to collect materials on this case only a year later. Therefore, his notes reflect only the opinion of some police officers of that time, and the information provided about possible suspects contains several factual errors. After the departure of the soldier with whom Tebram came from the pub, she had about 2 hours left to find a new client. It's possible that she ran into Jack the Ripper. The fact that this murder did not exactly match the Ripper's handwriting could indicate that over time he changed the mode of operandi, as he did later, causing more and more injuries to the victims. While the 5 canonical Ripper murders occurred approximately north, southeast, and west of Whitechapel, the Timber murder occurred near the geographical center of the area. It is possible that her murder was one of the first committed by the Ripper before he chose his later line of conduct. The exact number of victims of Jack the Ripper is currently unknown. It is the subject of controversy and ranges from 5 to 15. Nevertheless, there is a list of 5 canonical victims, with which, according to most researchers and persons involved in the investigation of the case in particular, the Chief Constable of the Criminal Investigation Department, Melville Macnaghten, adhered to the version of the 5 victims. It is highly likely that Martha Timber also died at the hands of the killer. Inspector Aberline, one of the leaders of the investigation into the Jack the Ripper case, added her to the list of 5 canonical victims. So, Mary Ann Nichols became the first of the 5 canonical victims. Mary Ann Nichols, née Walker, was born on August 26, 1845 year, on one street in London, in the family of the lockmaker Edward Walker and his wife Caroline. On January 16, 1864 year, Mary Ann married a printing worker William Nichols, from whom in the period from 1866 to 1879, she gave birth to 5 children a year ago. Either in 1880 or in 1881, the marriage broke up for reliably unknown reasons. Mary Ann's father accused William of abandoning her because of an affair with a nurse who attended the birth of their last child. In turn, Nichols claimed that he had evidence that his marriage with Mary lasted at least 3 years. After the date when his intrigue with the nurse allegedly began, and that his wife left him and engaged in prostitution. According to police, the couple broke up because of Mary Ann's addiction to alcohol. By law, William Nichols had to support his wife financially. He paid Mary Ann 5 shillings a week for the maintenance of the children. Until in 1882, I found out that she earns a living as a prostitute. Earnings obtained illegally exempted William from payments to his wife. Marian Nichols spent most of the rest of her life in workhouses and cheap public housing on handouts, and the meager means earned by prostitution. She lived with her father for a year or a little more, but left him after a quarrel. Edward Walker later claimed to have heard that Mary Ann was living in Walt with a blacksmith named Drew in early 1888. Nichols was placed in a workhouse in Lambeth when she was found sleeping in Trafalgar Square. She left home in May and got a job as a maid in the house of the married cheat Cowdery at Worthy. But she didn't last long there, as she suffered from alcoholism, and her employers were non-drinkers. 2 months later, Nicholas escaped, stealing clothes worth £3 and 10 shillings. At the time of her death, she was living in public housing in Spitalfield, where she shared a room with a certain Emily Nellie Holland. At about 2300 30 August 1888, Mary Ann Nichols was seen walking along Whitechapel Road. At 0:30, they were seen leaving the pub on Brick Lane Field. An hour later, due to the lack of fourpence for the night, she was kicked out of the house at 18 Troll Street. At the same time, Nichols said that she went to earn extra money, which will help her with a new hood. Nellie Holland was the last person to see Nichols alive at the intersection of Osborne Street and Whitechapel Road at 2:30, an hour before Nichols died. Mary Ann told Holland that she had earned enough money to pay for a 3-night stay in advance. "But I spent it all on alcohol." At about 3:40, the cabman found Mary Ann Nichols lying on the ground in front of the stable gate on Bucks Row, Whitechapel, 150 yards from the London hospital. Her skirt was up. Soon this cabman pointed out the body to Robert Paul, another cabman driving by on his way to work. The first one was sure the woman was dead, but Paul thought she might have been unconscious. And the men, lowering the skirt of the woman, went in search of the police. They reported the discovery to Constable Jonas Mason and continued on their way. While Mason was walking towards the body, Constable John Neal approached him from the other side and called the third Constable John Thane. As news of the murder spread, 3 butchers from the slaughterhouse on nearby Winthrop Street, who had been working overnight, came over to look at the body. Neither the butchers, nor the policemen patrolling the street, nor the residents of neighboring houses saw or heard anything suspicious that night. John Thane called Surgeon Henry Llewellyn, who arrived at 4 o'clock and determined that the woman had been dead for about half an hour. Her throat was cut twice from left to right. There was 1 deep laceration on the abdomen, several incisions across the abdomen, and 3 or 4 incisions in the right side, inflicted with the same blade with a length of at least 6 to 8 inches, 15 to 20 centimeters. Llewellyn expressed surprise that there was little blood at the scene of the discovery of the body. Enough to fill 2 large wine glasses or half a pint, less than a quarter of a liter maximum. His comment prompted speculation that Nichols was killed elsewhere. However, it turned out that a lot of blood leaked from the wounds soaked into the clothes, and this left no reason to doubt that the perpetrator killed the woman on the spot by quickly cutting her throat. Death was instantaneous. The killer inflicted the abdominal wound after the victim's death. It could take less than 5 minutes. When the woman's body was lifted, a puddle of dried blood was found under it. Since the murder was committed on the territory of the Bentle Green police station, it was initially investigated by local detectives John Spatling and Joseph Nelson, whose actions were unsuccessful. The press linked the crimes to the 2 previous Whitechapel murders of Emma Elizabeth Smith and Martha Tebram and suggested that the murders were committed by a group of individuals or a gang, as was the case with Smith. The London newspaper The Star published an assumption that a lone killer was guilty of the crime. Later, other newspapers supported this assumption. Suspicion that a serial killer was operating in London led to the fact that the case was handed over to inspectors from the Central Office of Scotland Yard, Frederick Aberline, Henry Moore, and Walter Simon Andrews. The identity of the deceased was helped to establish the markings of the Lambeth Workhouse laundry found on her clothes. The body was also identified by Nellie Holland and William Nichols. The death certificate states that Mary Ann was 42 years old at the time of the murder, a mistake that migrated to the plaque on the tombstone. Birth records indicate that she was 43 years old, which was confirmed by her father, who stated that she looked 10 years younger than her age. The investigation into Nichols' death began on the 1st of September. East Middlesex coroner Edwin Baxter was involved in the case, who also investigated the deaths of the previous 2 victims and the next 4. Reporters from The Times published the testimony of an unnamed participant in the investigation. 5 teeth were missing, and there was a small tear in the tongue. There was a bruise on the lower part of the jaw on the right. This could have been caused by a fist bump or a thumb press. There was a bruise on the left side of the face, which could also appear due to pressing with fingers. On the left side of the neck, about an inch under the jaw, there was an incision about 4 inches long, starting under the ear. On the same side, but slightly lower and an inch to the right, there was an incision that ended 3 inches below the right jaw. This incision completely dissected all the tissues up to the spine. The large vessels of the neck on both sides were cut. The incision was about 8 inches long. The incisions were made with such a long, rather sharp knife blade, used with great effort. No blood was found on the chest, as well as on the body or clothes. There were no injuries on the body up to the very bottom of the abdomen. There was a laceration 2 or 3 inches from the left side. The wound was very deep, touching the tissue. There were also several incisions on the abdomen. On the right side, there were 3 or 4 similar cuts that were caused by the blade being used by force and pressure. The injuries were inflicted from left to right and may have been done by a left-handed person. All the injuries were inflicted with the same instrument. Soon rumors began to spread that a local character nicknamed Leather Apron could have been involved in the murder of Mary Ann. Polish Jew John Pazer. The police investigated this version and concluded that there was no connection between the Leather Apron and Mary Ann's death. Nevertheless, some newspapers immediately picked up the idea and even published an imaginary description of the Leather Apron, using crude Jewish stereotypes. However, competing publications dismissed it as a mythical, exaggerated fantasy of a journalist. Pazer was arrested despite the absence of any evidence. However, when his alibi was confirmed, he was released. Pazer managed to get monetary compensation from at least one newspaper that called him a murderer. After several delays, which allowed the police to collect additional evidence, it was investigated on the 24th of September. Based on the available evidence, Coroner Baxter concluded that Nichols was killed just after 3 o'clock in the morning, at the same place where her body was found. He ruled out the possibility that her murder was related to Smith's death and Timber due to different methods and murder weapons. However, by the time the investigation into Nichols' death was completed on September 8th, another woman, Annie Chapman, was killed, and Baxter noted a great similarity between the 2 crimes. Therefore, the police investigations were combined. The subsequent murders of Straight and Edis on September 30th, which occurred a week after the investigation into Nichols' death was completed, as well as the Kelly murders, had the same handwriting. So the press and the public concluded that they were committed by one person, called Jack the Ripper. Mary Ann's funeral took place on the 6th of September, 1888. Her body was transported in a coffin of polished nits to the undertaker of Hanbury Street, Henry Smith. The funeral procession consisted of a hearse and 2 funeral carriages, in which Marian's father, ex-husband, grandson, and 2 children rode. Nicholas was buried in a public grave at Ilford Cemetery in London. Number 49 500, plot 318, at the end of 1996 year. The city authorities designated the grave of Mary Ann Nick as the canonical victim of Annie. Annie Chapman was born in Paddington in 1800 in the family of Ruth Chapman, Market Street, and George Smith, who served in the 2nd Regiment of the Life Guards. A girl born out of wedlock was named Eliza Ann Smith. Anne's parents were married in Paddington 6 months after her birth and in 1856 year. The family moved to Windsor. In addition to Ruth's daughter, George had a son, Fontaine, and 1 or 2 other daughters. Annie's sister later lived with her mother in Braunton, but Annie herself was living separately by that time. At the age of 28, Annie married a relative of her mother, John Chapman. The wedding took place on the 1st of May, 1869 year, in the Church of All Saints in Knightsbridge. The marriage certificate states that the couple lived in the Brompton at 29 Montpelier Place. In fact, Ruth Chapman lived here until her death in 1893. Annie and John lived in West London until 1881, when they returned back to Windsor. John worked as a coachman on a farm. The couple had 3 children: Emily Ruth Ennie Georgina, and John Jr. was born disabled. And Emily Ruth died of meningitis at the age of 12. According to reports, at the time of her mother's death, Annie Georgina was touring with a circus in France. Annie and John separated in 1884 or 85 year for unclear reasons. Police reports show that the divorce occurred on the grounds of drunkenness and immoral behavior of Annie. She was arrested several times for drunkenness. It is also assumed that John suffered from alcoholism. Chapman paid his ex-wife 10 shillings a week until his death on Christmas Day 1886 year. John died of cirrhosis of the liver and edema, which also confirms the version about the alkalosis of Chapman. Annie learned about the death of her ex-husband from his relatives and was very upset. In 1886, Chapman cohabited for a while with John Seavey, an employee who made a grid in public housing in Spitalfield, at 30 Dorset Street. Seavey's last name was actually a nickname and was used by both John and Annie herself. Sylvie broke up with Chapman shortly after her husband's death due to Annie's loss of a steady income. From May to June 1888, Chapman still lived on Dorset Street, but in a different house in 35th. There is an assumption that shortly before Oine's death, there was also a connection with the assistant mason Edward Stanley, who lived in Osborne Street, Whitechapel. They spent several weekends together, and Stanley regularly paid for Chapman's housing, on the condition that she would not have relationships with other men, since after her husband's death, Annie earned a living by prostitution, selling flowers and knitted things. Annie's friend Amelia Farmer noted that Chapman was very hard-working. "When I wasn't drinking, but it happened quite rarely. Between the middle and the end of August, Annie met with her brother Fontaine and told him that difficult times had come in her life. She refused to give her place of residence. Fontaine gave her 2 shillings, and they never saw each other again. A week before her death, Annie had a serious fight with another guest, Eliza Cooper. Versions of the reasons for the fight vary. It happened because of a man, a certain hawker Harry or Edward Stanley, who paid for housing for both women, or because of a bar of soap that Chapman borrowed and forgot to return. Chapman left her apartment on the day of the murder at 2 o'clock in the morning, with the intention of receiving money from a client to pay rent. Her mutilated body was found around 6 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, September 8th, on the ground near the doorway in the backyard of number 29 Pucconbury Street. The victim's throat was cut. The cut went from left to right. Chapman's body was gutted. The intestines were removed from the abdominal cavity and thrown over the shoulders. In addition, a study conducted at the morgue showed that the victim was missing part of the uterus. Pathologist George Baxter Phillips opined that the killer must have had the anatomical knowledge to cut out the reproductive organs in one motion with a blade about 6 to 8 inches long. However, the idea that the murder had surgical skill was rejected by other specialists. Since the body was not thoroughly examined at the scene, there was also an assumption that the organs had been removed by morgue staff, who often used already opened bodies, extracting organs from them for sale as surgical samples. On the 10th of September, the police arrested a well-known local resident, a Polish Jew John Pazer, who was nicknamed Leather Apron, and had a reputation for terrorizing local prostitutes. He had previously been questioned in the Mary Ann Nichols case, but no connection was found. Nevertheless, some newspapers immediately picked up the idea and even published an imaginary description of the Leather Apron, using crude Jewish stereotypes. However, competing publications dismissed it as a mythical, exaggerated fantasy of a journalist. Pazer was arrested despite the absence of any evidence. However, when his alibi at the time of both murders was confirmed, he was released. As already mentioned, Pazer managed to get monetary compensation from at least one newspaper that called him a murderer. Witness Elizabeth Long said she saw Chapman talking to a man at about 5:30 in the morning, right in the backyard of number 29, Pucconberry Street. Her body was found there half an hour later. Coroner Baxter concluded that the man Mrs. Long saw was the killer. Mrs. Long described him as a man in his early 40s, slightly taller than Chapman, with a dark complexion, and not a local shabby noble appearance. He was wearing a brown deer hunter's hat and a dark coat. Another witness, carpenter Albert Kadash, entered the adjacent courtyard of number 27 Hanbury Street at the same time that Mrs. Long saw the victim. And first I heard voices in the yard, and then the sound of an object falling in front of the fence. Robert Anderson was appointed head of the Criminal Investigation Department on the 1st of September. However, on the 7th of September, he went on sick leave to Switzerland. Superintendent Thomas Arnold, who headed Department H, went on vacation on the 2nd of September. Anderson's absence led to more confusion, so the head of the department, Charles Warren, handed over the investigation of the Whitechapel murders to the Chief Inspector of Scotland Yard, Donald Swanson. New researchers took into custody a German hairdresser, Karl Ludwig, on September 18th on suspicion of murder. But he was released less than 2 weeks later, when the next double murder was committed, which showed that the real criminal was still at large. Metropolitan Police Detective Constable Walter Dew wrote in his memoirs that the murders caused panic throughout London. The mob attacked the police station on the Commercial, believing that the killer was being held there. In order to prevent anti-Semitic speech, after the rumor spread that the murder was committed by Jews, Samuel Montague, MP for Whitechapel, offered a reward of £100, which is equivalent to £10,000 today, to anyone who finds the real killer. Local residents founded the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, chaired by George Lusk, and offered a reward for apprehending the killer. What the Metropolitan Police, on the instructions of the General Directorate, refused to do, because it could lead to the appearance of false or misleading information. The committee hired two private detectives to investigate the case. Elizabeth Long Fox, straight innate Gustav's daughter. She was born on November 27, 1843. The alleged victim of an unknown serial killer nicknamed Jack the Ripper, who killed and mutilated several women in the London borough of Whitechapel from the end of August to the beginning of November, 1888th year. Some researchers explain that the nickname Long Fox was used as a pseudonym. Others believe that it came from her surname, adopted after marriage, since stride means long step. It is also assumed that the nickname is given because of her height. Elizabeth Gustav's daughter was born on the 27th of November, 1843rd year in Torsland, west of Ottenberg, Sweden, in the family of farmer Gustav Eriksson and his wife Beata Karls Dotzer. In 1860, she worked as a domestic servant of the Karl Johan district in Gothenburg. For the next few years, she moved from county to county, unlike the other victims of the Whitechapel murders, who turned to prostitution after a broken marriage. Straight became a prostitute before marriage in March 1865. The Gothenburg police registered her as a prostitute who was twice treated for venereal disease. On April 21st, she gave birth to a stillborn baby girl. The following year, she moved to London, possibly to work as a servant in the family. On the 7th of March, 1869, she married John Thomas Stride, a shipwright from Shearns, who was 13 years older than her. For a while, the couple ran a coffee shop in Poplar, East London. In March 1877, Liz Straight moved to the Poplar workhouse, which gave reason to assume that the couple had separated. They apparently re-established their relationship in 1881. But they broke up again, this time finally at the end of the year. She told her friends that her husband and 2 of her 9 children died when the Princess Alice steamer sank on the River Thames in 1878 year. According to her story, during the accident, one of the victims hit her in the face while they were swimming to shore. That's why she began to stutter. In fact, Joe Straight died of consumption at the Poplar and Stepney Hospital on October 24, 1884, more than 5 years before the disaster. And they had no children. After her divorce from her husband, Straight lived in a Whitechapel flophouse. Once or twice she was assisted by the church in Sweden and London. Most of the time, from 1885 until her death, she lived with a local docker, Michael Kidney, on Devonshire Street. According to the description of an acquaintance, she had a calm temperament, although many times she appeared before the Thames Magistrates' Court for drunkenness and debauchery, under the name of Anna Fitzgerald. She was learning Yiddish. Her relationship with Kidney continued from time to time. In April 1887, she brought charges of assault against him, but she could not prove it in court. A few days before her death, she left the Kidney. Dr. Thomas Bernardo, a well-known philanthropist, stated that he saw Straight in a flophouse at Flower and Dean Street on Wednesday, the 26th of September. On the night of the murder on September 29th, Straight was wearing a black jacket and skirt with a picture of rose flowers, ferns and asparagus leaves. Her outfit was complemented with a black crepe hood. Around 11 o'clock in the evening on Berner Street, she may have been seen with a client described as a short man with a dark mustache, in a morning suit and a bowler hat. She was seen there again, at about 11:45 in the evening, but this time with a man in a cap. At 12:30 in the morning, William Smith saw her with a man in a stiff felt hat, opposite the International Workers' Educational Club, a socialist and predominantly Jewish social club at 40 Berner Street. This man was carrying a package about 45 centimeters long. Straight's body was discovered around 1 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, September 13th, 1888. Louis Dishmas, manager of the Workers' Club, in the adjacent courtyard of Dutfield. Dimschitz drove into the yard with a pony and a 2-wheeled cart, and suddenly his horse tripped over something. This was Elizabeth's body. It was so dark in the yard that he couldn't see her body until he lit a match. Blood was still flowing from the wound on her neck, and it seemed that she had been killed just a few minutes before his arrival. During the period from 12:30 to 12:50 at night, the departing members of the club, who attended the debate on the need for socialism among Jews, followed by the singing of the community, did not see anything suspicious in the courtyard. Mrs. Mortimer also lived on Berner Street, and at about the same time went outside to listen to singing, and did not see anyone go out into the yard. Mortimer reported that she saw a man with a shiny black bag, which she would later write about in the press. The man Mrs. Mortimer saw turned out to be a member of the club named Leon Holstein, and he was excluded from the list of suspects. The police checked the other members of the club, as well as the surrounding facilities, and questioned residents of the area. A witness named Israel Schwartz reported that around 12:45 in the morning, Straight was attacked and knocked to the ground near the Dutfield yard. The attacker probably shouted to the second man standing nearby, "Lipsky." It was considered an anti-Semitic mockery at the time and came on behalf of the notorious poisoner Israel Lipsky. Schwartz did not testify at the investigation into the murder of Straight. Perhaps this was due to the fact that he was Hungarian, and he spoke very bad English at about 12:45 in the morning. Straight or someone like her was noticed by James Brown, who denied the information that someone approached her. A note in the margins of the Ministry of Internal Affairs materials notes that Stride had time to meet with another man between her death and the last observations of her. Later, the manager of Dimschitz said that, in his opinion, the killer was still in the yard after the murder. No money was found attached. Therefore, it is quite possible that her overnight fees were stolen, both during the attack, noticed by Schwartz, and by the killer himself. Regardless of this problem, all the facts point to the fact that Straight willingly entered Dutfield's yard, either in the company of her killer or ran into him already in the yard. Local Dr. Frederick William Blackwell was present at the scene shortly before the arrival of Dr. George Baxter Phillips, who dealt with the case of the previous Whitechapel murder victim Annie Chapman, and also dealt with the later case of Mary Jane Kelly Phillips. The body was lying on the left side, the face turned to the wall, the head facing the yard, and the legs towards the street. The left arm was outstretched, and there was a bag of sweets in it. His right hand was on his stomach. The back of his hand and wrists were covered in blood. The legs were stretched out so that it was close to the wall. The body and face were warm, and the hand was cold. The feet were also quite warm. The victim had a silk handkerchief around his neck, and it seemed slightly torn. Later I found out that it was shortened. Its shape corresponded to the correct angle of the jaw. Her throat was deeply cut, and there was an abrasion under her right forehead, about 1.5 inches in diameter, clearly stained with blood. At 3 o'clock on Monday afternoon, at St. George's Morgue, Dr. Blackwell and I conducted a postmortem examination. Rigor mortis was noted. There was dirt on the left side of his face and on his head. On both shoulders, especially on the right, under the collarbone, and in the front of the chest, there was a bluish staining, which I have observed since then twice. There was a clear cut on her neck. It was 6 inches long, and started 2.5 inches in a straight line below the angle of the jaw. It went 3/4 of an inch, and then it got deeper. The cut was very clean and slightly deviated downwards. Arteries and other vessels were cut. The tissue incision on the right side was more superficial, and it passed 2 inches below the right corner of the jaw. The deep vessels on this side were not affected. From this it was obvious that the bleeding was caused by a partial rupture of the carotid artery on the left, for which a knife with a small blade could be used. Decomposition began with the skin. Dark brown spots were on the front surface of the left chin. There was a deformation in the bones of the right leg, which was not straight, but curved forward. Except for the neck, injuries were not observed. The body was washed more thoroughly, and I was able to see some healing ulcers. The lobe of the left ear was torn, as if from removing or wearing an earring, but it's almost completely healed. When removing the scalp, there were no signs of bruising. The heart was small, the left ventricle was very narrowed, and the right one was only slightly. There were no blood clots in the pulmonary artery, but the right ventricle was filled with them. The left one was completely shortened, so it was completely empty. The stomach was large, and the mucous membrane was overflowing with blood. It contained partially digested food, apparently consisting of cheese, potatoes, and flour powder, flour or crushed grain. All the teeth on the lower jaw on the left were missing. Blackwell thought that Straight might have pulled his neck back to the ground before cutting his throat. Phillips agreed that Straight was probably on the ground when she was killed by a quick left-to-right blow to the neck. Bruises on her chest may also indicate that she was pinned to the ground during the attack. The inquest was opened on the 1st of October by coroner Edwin Baxter. The next day, conflicting testimony was heard regarding Straight's identity. The police seemed to be sure that Straight was Swedish Elizabeth Gustavsdotter. But Mrs. Mary Malcolm swore that the body belonged to her sister Elizabeth Watts. During the investigation, other witnesses identified the dead woman as Elizabeth Straight. Everyone, including the clerk of the Swedish church in Prince Sven Olsen Square. The story with Malcolm was finally rejected only on October 24th, when Elizabeth Watts refuted her sister's story, presenting herself personally at the inquest as living proof that she did not die. And Walter Straight, Elizabeth Straight's nephew, confirmed her identity. Coroner Baxter believed that Straight was subjected to a quick, sudden action. It's possible the killer used the scarf she was wearing to grab her from behind before slitting her throat, as suggested by Blackwell. Baxter, however, believed that the lack of a cry for help and the absence of obvious signs of a struggle indicated that she lay down on the ground voluntarily. When she was discovered, she was still holding a package of breath-stopping candies in her left hand, indicating that she didn't even have time to defend herself. Grocer Matthew Packer made it clear to two private detectives hired by the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee to Legrand and Batchelor that he had sold the grapes to Straight and the killers. However, he told Police Sergeant Stephen White that he had closed his shop after seeing nothing suspicious. During the investigation, pathologists strongly stated that Strike did not hold, swallow, or consume grapes. They described the contents of her stomach as cheese, potatoes, and flour powder. However, Packer's story appeared in the press, and private detectives did find a vine branch in the yard. When questioned again by police, Packer described a man aged between 25 and 30, slightly taller than her, and wearing a soft felt hat. But he told a private investigator that the man was middle-aged and of large build. None of his descriptions matched the statements of other witnesses who may have seen Strike with clients shortly before her murder. But all descriptions were different. In his book Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, Stephen Knight linked the eminent physician Sir William Gull to the murder of Straight, on the grounds that both of them were carrying grapes that evening. Another author of a book about the Ripper, Martin Fado, called this a wild accusation. Further doubts are raised by the story of the character Legrand, also known as Charles Grant, Charles Grundy, Charles Grant, Christian Nielsen, and Christian Nelson, that is, one of the people hired by the Vigilance Committee to investigate the crime. He had a large number of convictions, including for assaulting a prostitute and a criminal record for theft. In 1889th year, he was convicted of conspiracy to defraud and served 2 years in prison. After his release, he was arrested for possession of a revolver and charged with extortion, a crime for which he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The chief commander of the Ripper investigation, Chief Inspector Donald Wanson, noted that any statement made by Packer would be practically useless as evidence. Straight's murder took place at the height of Jack the Ripper's activities. However, unlike at least 6 other murder victims attributed to the perpetrator, each of whom suffered extensive abdominal injuries in addition to 1 or more neck wounds, Straight was not injured, as her only injury was a deep cut measuring 2.5 inches below her jaw. The carotid artery and trachea were cut. The wound ended below her right jaw. Because there were 2 other murders in Whitechapel County, the murders of Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman, each of which was carried out by cutting the throat. Straight's murder was also attributed to the Whitechapel murders investigation, and was widely believed to have been committed by the same killer. However, some experts in the case conclude that Straight's murder was unrelated, on the grounds that the body was not subjected to any mutilation, that this was the only murder that occurred south of Whitechapel Road, and that the blade that cut the throat could have been shorter and had a different design. Most experts, however, believe that the similarities in this case are sufficient to link Straight's murder to the earlier Ripper murders, in addition to the murder of Catherine Eddowes, which occurred later that night. The murder of Elizabeth Straight is considered one of the canonical Ripper murders due to numerous factors, including the general physical and vital characteristics of the victim, the day of the week when she was killed, the time of death, the place of murder, and the method of murder. It is believed that Straight's murder itself, and the subsequent acts of mutilation and evisceration that her killer intended to inflict, were interrupted after he cut her throat and before he had the opportunity to perform these actions on her body. Less than an hour later, Catherine Eddowes was murdered in Meter Square, and Straight and Eddowes lived on Flower and Dean Streets. The deaths of Eddowes and Straight led London to a new wave of panic, as it was the first time that two murders attributed to the Ripper occurred in one night. On the 1st of October, Michael Kidney drunkenly entered the police station on Lyman Street and condemned the incompetence of the police. According to him, if he had been a policeman on duty on Burner Street that night, he would have shot himself. The following year, he appears in the Whitechapel Wathouse Hospital records as many as 3 times, with syphilis in June, lumbago in August, and dyspepsia in October. Catney came under suspicion of murder because of his stormy relationship with Straight. Besides, there was no record of his alibi. The police, however, seem to have excluded him from the investigation, and his deteriorating health and suffering at the police station indicate that he took her death badly. Elizabeth Straight was buried on Saturday, October 6, 1888, in the cemetery of East London Plaistow, in London, in grave number 15, 509, on plot 37. Few people attended the funeral. All expenses were paid by the undertaker Hawkes. On October 19th, Chief Inspector Swanson wrote a report detailing that 80,000 leaflets had been sent out asking for help with the investigation, and about 2,000 local residents had been interrogated. Catherine Eddowes, also known as Kate Conway and Kate Kelly after 2 marriages, born in the Gracely Green area of Wolverhampton on the 14th of April, 1842. Her parents were tinplate stamping George Eddowes and his wife Catherine née Evans. The family moved to London a year after she was born, and her mother eventually gave birth to 10 more children. Once as a child, Eds was adopted as an orphan in a Bermondsey workhouse. She later returned to Wolverhampton to work as a tinplate stamper. This job was offered to her by her aunt. Soon after, Edu dropped this job, often moving between Birmingham and Wolverhampton. While living in Birmingham, she started a relationship with a former soldier named Thomas Conway, with whom she had 2 children. At one stage of this relationship, Edis got a tattoo with her husband's initials K written in blue ink on her left forearm. Edis' height was 155 centimeters. She had dark red hair and brown eyes. Friends later described her as a very cheerful woman, always singing, as well as intelligent and educated, but having a cruel character. In 1868, Catherine moved to London, where she gave birth to 3 more children. While living in London, Edis started drinking. She abandoned her family in 1880. The following year, she lived with a new man named John Kelly in a Cooney dorm in the middle of London's most infamous slums. Here she took up daily work as a prostitute so that there was something to pay for the apartment. To avoid contact with his ex-wife, Conway registered his military pension in the name of Quinn and kept the addresses of all his sons secret. In the summer of 1888, Addles Kelly and her friend Emily Burrell got a part-time job picking hops. After the harvest was over, they returned to London and quickly spent their entire salary. Addles and Kelly split the next sixpence between them. She took fourpence to pay for a dorm bed, and Kelly took twopence. Just enough so that she could spend the night in a hostel in the neighboring district. They met the next morning, the 29th of September. And early in the afternoon, Edis told Kelly that she was going to Bermondsey to try to get some money from her daughter Annie Phillips, who was married to a gunsmith in the Southwark area. Having received money from pawning her shoes, barefoot Kelly went to bed in a boarding house just after 8 in the evening, and, according to the owner's assistant, stayed there all night. At 8:30 on the evening of Saturday, the 29th of September, Edis was found by Constable Louis Robinson, lying drunk on the road in Aldgate High Street. She was taken into custody, and then taken to Bishop's Gate Police Station, where she was held under the name of nothing, until she became sober enough to be released at 1 o'clock in the morning on September 30th. After her release, she gave her name and address to Mary and Kelly of 6 Fashion Street. After leaving the station, instead of turning right and taking the shortest route to her house on Flower and Dean Streets, Edis turned left and walked in the direction of the Elgate area. She was last seen alive at 1:35 a.m. by 3 witnesses: Joseph Luende, Joseph Haim Levy, and Harry Harris, who had just left the club on Duke Street. She was standing and talking to a man at the entrance to the church aisle, which led southwest from Duke Street to Mitro Square, along the south wall of the Great Synagogue in London. Only Luendo was able to provide a description of the man, whom he described as a fair-haired man in a dark blue jacket, wearing a cap and a red scarf. Chief Inspector Donald Wanson noted in his report that Land identified the woman as Edis, which was very doubtful. He wrote that Land said that some of the victim's clothes, which were shown to him, resembled the clothes of the woman he had seen. A quote that was black, similar in size. Patrolman James Harvey was walking to the church aisle from Duke Street shortly after, but his deviation from the patrol area forced him to return to the church aisle on Duke Street without leaving the square. At 1:45 a.m., the mutilated body of Edis was found by police officer Edward Watkins in the southwest of Mitro Square Street. Watkins stated that he entered the street at 1:44. Earlier, he was there at 1:30 in the morning. He called for help from an employee of a tea shop located on this street, night watchman George James Morris. He was a former policeman and didn't notice anything unusual. There was also another watchman on this street, George Clapp, as well as police officer Richard Pierce. Police surgeon Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown, who arrived after 2 o'clock in the morning, said the following about the scene of the incident. The body was lying on its back, the head was turned to the left shoulder. The hands were lying next to the body, both palms up. The fingers are slightly bent. There was a thimble on the finger of his right hand. The clothes are raised above the stomach. Her thighs were bare. The left leg is extended along the torso line. The belly was bare. The right leg is bent at the hip and at the knees. The hood was on the back of the head. The face is badly disfigured. Throat cut. A neckerchief was thrown over his throat. The intestines were pulled out and placed behind the right shoulder. They were smeared with some thick substance. A piece of the body about 60 centimeters long was torn from the torso and placed between the body and the left arm, apparently by design. The lobe and auricle of the right ear are obliquely cut. On the sidewalk on the left side of the neck, around the shoulder and upper arm, there was a certain amount of clotted blood, and a blood-colored liquid serum that flowed under the neck to the right shoulder in the direction of the sidewalk. The body was still warm. She didn't die from pain shock. She died half an hour later. We were looking for superficial bruises and didn't see any. No blood on the skin of the abdomen or any discharge on the thighs. There were no blood splatters on the bricks or sidewalk around. No traces of blood below the middle of the body. Several clots were found after the body was removed. There was no blood on the front of the clothes. There were also no traces of a recent sexual relationship. On the same day, Brown performed an autopsy on Edith's body, noting the following, after carefully washing the back of his left hand. A bruise the size of sixpence was found between the thumb and index finger. Recent and red. Several large bruises on the right shin were received earlier. The arms and hands were bronze. No bruises on the scalp, back, or elbows. The cause of death was bleeding in the carotid artery. Death occurred instantly, and the injuries were inflicted after death. There wasn't much blood on the killer. Someone made an incision on the right side of the body while kneeling. The abdominal membrane was cut through on the left side, and the left kidney was carefully removed. I believe that the killer must have had considerable knowledge of the position of the organs in the abdominal cavity, and the method of their removal. The removed parts will not be used for any professional purposes. It took a lot of knowledge to remove the kidney and know where it was placed. Such knowledge can be possessed by someone who has a habit of cutting animals. I think the killer had enough time. It will take at least 5 minutes. I believe it was done by one person. Edis was killed between 1:35 and 1:45 in the morning. Police Officer Thomas Bond disagrees with Brown's assessment of the killer's skill level. Bond's report, provided by the police, stated, in each case, the mutilation was committed by a person with no scientific or anatomical knowledge. In my opinion, he doesn't even have the technical knowledge of a butcher. He didn't kill horses or other people. He wasn't used to slaughtering the dead. Local surgeon Dr. George Williams Kira, who was the first doctor on the scene, and city physician William C. Vic Saunders, who was also present at the autopsy, also believed that the killer lacked anatomical skills and did not look for specific organs. In addition to the abdominal wounds, the killer cut Edu's face. The incision passed through the bridge of the nose, both cheeks, and through the eyelids of both eyes. The tip of her nose and part of one ear were cut off. The Royal London Hospital on Whitechapel Road keeps some images from the crime scene and murder plans in Meter Square. Executed by City Inspector Frederick Foster, they were first presented to the public in 1966 by Francis Camps, professor of forensic medicine at the University of London, based on his analysis of the surviving documents. Camps concluded that the cuts left on the body could not have been made by an expert. The investigation into the Edis case was launched on the 4th of October by Samuel Langham Coroner of the City of London. A house search was conducted, but nothing suspicious was found. Brown expressed the belief that Edis was killed by a blow to the throat while she was lying on the ground, and then her body was mutilated. A mustard jar with 2 bail receipts issued by Emily Burrell and Ann Kelly was found among Edis' personal belongings. This eventually led to her identification by John Kelly, after he read about the receipts in the newspaper. His identity was confirmed by Catherine Eddowes' sister, Eliza Gold. No money was found with her. Although the murder took place in the City of London, it was committed close to the border of Whitechapel, where the previous murders took place. The mutilation of Edis' body and the removal of her left kidney and part of her uterus by her killer bore the signature of Jack the Ripper and were similar to the earlier victim Annie Chapman. Due to the location of Metro Square Street, the City of London Police, under the command of Detective Inspector James McWilliam, joined the murder investigation along with the Metropolitan Police, which dealt with previous murders. About 3 o'clock in the morning, on the same day that Edos was killed, a bloody part of her apron, contaminated with feces, was found in the passage leading to the house 108-119 on Golston Street. Above him on the wall was written in chalk, "Jews will not be held responsible for anything." We will talk more about this inscription a little later. The inscription may not have been connected with the murder, but somehow it was washed away before dawn. On the orders of the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Charles Warren, who was afraid that it would cause anti-Jewish riots. 3 streets led to Meter Square. Church Aisle to the northeast, Meter Street to the southwest, and St. James Place to the northwest. When Constable Harvey saw no one at the church aisle and Constable Watkins saw no one at Meter Street, the killer must have left the square north across St. James Street from Gulston Street, which was within a quarter of an hour's walk from Mitre Square on the direct route to Flower and Dean Streets where Eddles lived, which suggests that her killer also lived nearby and went there after the murder. Major Henry Smith, acting commissioner of the city police, wrote in his memoirs that he found bloodied water in a public sink in the yard off Dorset Street. And since the water was slowly flowing out of the sink, he assumed that the Ripper had only a few minutes to escape. The author of the book about the Ripper, Martin Fado, considered it unlikely that the criminal would wait to wash his hands in a public place 40 minutes after the crime. And Smith's memoirs are unreliable and embellished for dramatic effect. The official police reports don't mention it at all. Catherine Eddowes was buried on Monday, October 8, 1888, in a coffin, and tied up in the London Cemetery in a common grave number 49,336, plot number 318. Kelly and Sister Eddowes attended the funeral. Currently, Site 318 has been reused as a memorial garden for cremated remains. At the end of 1996 year, the cemetery authorities decided to mark her grave with a memorial plaque in 2014 year. Mitochondrial DNA matching the DNA of one of the descendants of fetus was extracted from a shawl, presumably taken from the murder scene. DNA matching was based on one of 7 small segments taken from hypervariable regions. The segment contained a variation of the sequence described as 314.1C, and was considered unusual with a repetition rate of only 1 in 290,000 cases worldwide. However, the professor, Sir Alec Jeffreys, and others noted that there was actually an error in the nomenclature for the general variation of the sequence 315.1C, and in fact, it is present in more than 99% of the sequences. The other DNA taken from the handkerchief matched the DNA of a relative of Aaron Kosminski, one of the suspects. This match was also based on a segment of mitochondrial DNA. But no information was provided that would allow us to assess the generality of the sequence. The shawl's owner, British writer Russell Edwards, claimed that coincidences proved that Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. Others disagree. Donald Trumbull criticized these claims, saying that the police did not indicate a single handkerchief among Eddowes' belongings. And mitochondrial DNA expert Peter Gill said that the handkerchief was of dubious origin, and several people who could leave their DNA profile on it had treated it. It is known that 2 descendants of Eddowes were in the same room with this shawl for 3 days in the year 2007. And according to one of the critics, the shawl was available to a lot of people who touched it, breathed on it, and watered it. And now let's go back to the mysterious inscription on the wall. After the murders of Elizabeth Straight and Catherine Eddowes on the night of September 30th, 1888, law enforcement agencies conducted a search in the area of the crime scene in an attempt to find a suspect, witnesses, or evidence. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, Constable Alfred Long of the Greater London Police Service found a dirty, bloody piece of an apron in the entrance of a house built by the Model Housing Company and numbered 108-119 on Goldston Street, Whitechapel. The fabric was later identified as part of an apron worn by Catherine Eddowes. At the place where the piece of apron was found, there was an inscription made in white chalk on the wall itself, or on the dirty brick lining of the door jamb. According to Long's report, the inscription he read was as follows, and in not be blamed for. Detective Constable Daniel Hales of the City of London Police, who arrived at the scene a short time later, put forward another version about the contents of the inscription. De Just will beamed. The third version of De Just, a copy of the inscription of the corresponding version of Long, was attached to the report of the Commissioner of Police of Greater London, Sir Charles Warren, to the Home Office. After the murder of Mary Ann Nichols committed on August 31st, 1888, rumors spread that this murder was the work of a Jew nicknamed Leather Apron, which led to anti-Semitic demonstrations. One Jew, a man named John Pitzer, who had a reputation for raping prostitutes and was nicknamed Leather Apron because of his shoemaking, was arrested but released after his alibi at the time of the murder was confirmed. Police Superintendent Thomas Arnold visited the scene and saw the inscription. Later, in his report on November 6 in the Home Office, he argued that given the strong anti-Jewish sentiment that already exists in society, the discovery of the inscription can cause riots. I have the pleasure to inform you that on the morning of the 30th of last September, my attention was drawn to a certain inscription on the wall at the entrance to the living quarters, located at number 108 Galston Street, Whitechapel, which includes the following words, and the word "on" is subsequently crossed out. And knowing that as a result, suspicion fell on a Jew named John Pizza, nicknamed Leather Apron, who was involved in the murder on Hanbury Street some time ago. Taking into account the strong sentiment against Jews in general, as well as the fact that the building on which the inscription was found is located in an area inhabited mainly by representatives of the Jewish faith, I am afraid that the preservation of the inscription may lead to riots, and therefore I think it desirable that the inscription be removed, bearing in mind that the fact that it is in such a place, that it will annoy people entering and leaving the building. The degree of religious tension was already high, and it was not far from riots. Arnold ordered his subordinate to stand ready with a sponge to erase the inscription while he consulted with Commissioner Warren. The issue of opening the inscription for a while in order to wait for the arrival of photographers or its partial removal was discussed, but Arnold and Warren, who was personally present at the scene, believed that it would be too dangerous, and Warren later stated that he found it desirable to erase the inscription at one time. While the inscription on Goldston Street was found on the territory of the subordinate police of Greater London, the piece of apron belonged to the victim killed in the City of London, which has its own police department. Some officers, especially those representing the City of London Police, disagreed with Arnold and Warren's decision to destroy the inscription and believed that the inscription was part of the crime scene and should at least be photographed before being erased. But the inscription was erased from the wall at 5:30 in the morning. According to the police official who supervised the investigation of the Whitechapel murders, the handwriting that was executed on the wall does not match the handwriting of the author of the notorious Dear Boss letter, in which he took responsibility for the murder and used the signature Jack the Ripper. We will talk more about this letter and other messages later. Also, police contemporaries of the events described came to the conclusion that the inscription was an illiterate attack on the Jewish population living in this territory. The police questioned all the residents of the house 108-119 on Golston Street, but it was not possible to find out who was the author of the inscription or the killer. According to historian Philip Sugden, there are at least 3 possible interpretations of this event. Moreover, all 3 are possible, but none of them is provable. First of all, the inscription was not made by the killer at all, but a piece of the apron was planted at the place of execution of the inscription, either accidentally or intentionally. Secondly, the inscription could have been made in order to catch the killer on his own words. A certain Jew caught himself and his fellow tribesmen. The third interpretation, according to Sugden, one of the most beloved both in Scotland Yard and among representatives of the Jewish community in London, the inscription was a deliberate ploy designed to fabricate a case against Jews, beating the police off the trail of the real killer. Walter Detective Constable Whitechapel was inclined to believe that the inscription was accidental and had nothing to do with the murder. At the same time, Chief Inspector Henry Moore and Sir Robert Anderson, both from Scotland Yard, thought that the inscription was the work of a murderer. Researcher Martin Fado notes that the inscription contains a double negative, which is a common feature of the Cockney dialect. Fado suggests that the inscription can be translated into literary English like this: Jews will not be held responsible for anything, and that this inscription was executed by someone who was sure that he had suffered an insult from one of the many Jewish merchants and traders from the area. In Thomas Slayman's controversial book Jack the Ripper, a British intelligence agent, the author cites the little-known fact that Jus is a Manchu word meaning to, while Sir Charles Warren, a respected archaeologist who knew both the biblical and Manchu languages, was forced to declare the inappropriateness of such an interpretation, and yet he admitted that he was initially confused with Slayman's reference to in 1909 year. Warren presided over a lecture by Claude Ranger Condor on the origin of the Chinese at Caxton Hall in London, where attention was drawn to the similarity of the Manchu language with European, while the word Jew was characterized as being of the same root with the English words dual, double, duet, duo. Duet. Another explanation was offered by Robert Donston Stevenson, a journalist and writer interested in occultism and black magic. In an article signed by the one who thinks he knows, published in the newspaper Pall Mall Gazette of December 1st, 1888, Stevenson, taking into account the construction of the phrase as a whole, the presence of double negation, the double use of a certain article d, and unusual spelling errors, suggested that the Ripper was most likely of French origin. Stevenson stated that even an uneducated Englishman or an ignorant Jew is unlikely to spell the word Jew with a spelling error, despite the fact that the existing spelling is similar to French. He excluded French-speaking Swiss and Belgians from the list of suspects, since the distinctive character traits of both of these nationalities do not represent the commission of crimes of this class. On the contrary, in France, the murder of prostitutes has long been practiced. It is considered almost the property of French crime. This statement was disputed by a native French speaker, for whom this language was his native language. In a letter to the editor of the aforementioned publication, which was published on December 6th of the same year, the writer Stephen Knight suggested that Jus should be interpreted not as Jews, but as his own. Jubila Jubila Jubilum of the three murderers of Hiram Abif, a semi-legendary figure of Freemasonry. In addition, according to Knight, the inscription indicates that the killer or killers are a participant in a Masonic conspiracy. There is, however, no evidence that anyone before Knight ever addressed the three figures known by the names of Jesus in connection with the inscription in question. Knight's guesses have been used in fictional explanations of murders, such as in the movie Murder by Order and in the comic book From Hell by Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell, in addition to confusion about the more precise wording and meaning of the inscription, as well as the question of whether it was written by the killer or not. Writer and former homicide investigator Trevor Marriott considered another possibility. The piece of apron probably wasn't necessarily thrown away by the killer on the way back to the West End from Mitre. It could have been used by the victim herself for sanitary and hygienic purposes and thrown out by her on the way from the East End towards me. At the same time, according to Mariotta's own words, many experts consider this explanation incredible. According to the modern criminologist historian Donald Rumbello, the inscription was made by Jack the Ripper, under the influence of ideas about the unfair structure of the world. To date, the question of whether this inscription is related to the murder has not been completely resolved. Many modern researchers prefer a later explanation, believing that the piece of apron was thrown out earlier than the inscription appeared, and the inscription itself was random. They believe that anti-Semitic graffiti was commonplace in the Whitechapel of that time, and that such behavior, expressed in exposing such obvious traces of a crime, and wasting time creating an inscription to confuse the police, is uncharacteristic for most known types of murderers. Mary Jane Kelly, also known as Mary Janet Kelly, White Emma, Red and Black Mary, according to general assumptions, the fifth and last victim of Jack the Ripper, who killed and mutilated prostitutes in the Whitechapel area. From the end of August to the beginning of October 1888. At the time of her death, she was 25 years old. She lived in poverty. According to the reports of that time, her height was 170 centimeters. The color of her hair remained undefined, as implied by her various nicknames. According to various reports, she was blonde or red-haired. The nickname Black Mary implies that she was a dark brunette. Her eyes were blue. Detective Walter Dew writes in his autobiography that he knew her and describes her as a very attractive and beautiful and cheerful girl. He states that she always wore a clean white apron and never wore a hat. Sir Melville Macnegan of the Metropolitan Police, who had not seen her in person, wrote that by the standards of that time, she had considerable personal appeal. In the November 10th issue of the Daily Telegraph, 1888, Kelly was described as a tall, slender, blonde girl, with a fresh face and attractive appearance. She was reported to be fluent in Welsh. Compared to other Ripper victims, Mary Kelly's origins are hidden. There are no documents. It is possible that most of the information about her is embellished according to Joseph Barnett, with whom she lived shortly before her death. Kelly told him that she was born in Limerick, Ireland, in 1863 year, although the district of the city is unknown. When she was little, the family moved to Wales. Burnett said Kelly told him her father's name was John Kelly. He worked at a steel mill in Carnarvonshire or in Carmarthenshire. According to Barnett's memoirs, Kelly mentioned that she had 7 brothers and at least 1 sister. One brother named Henry supposedly served in the 2nd Battalion of the Scots Guards. She once said that her personal friend Lizzie Elbrook, also a former family friend, performs on the London theatre stage. Kelly's landlord John McCarthy said that Kelly sometimes received letters from Ireland, but Barnett denied this. Barnett and her former roommate Mrs. Cart said that Kelly was from a family of well-to-do people. Cart said that Kelly was a great student and a mediocre artist. However, Barnett told the coroner at the inquest that she often asked him to read newspaper articles about the murders. It spoke of her illiteracy. In 1879, Kelly reportedly married a coal miner named Davis. 2 or 3 years later, he was killed by an explosion in a mine. She said she had been in hospital in Cardiff for 8 months and then left with her cousin. It is believed that it was at this moment that she began her activity as a prostitute. There are no records that have survived to the present that she was in Cardiff. Apparently, she moved from Cardiff to London in 1884 and found a job in a brothel in the wealthier West End. According to reports, one of the clients invited her to France, but she immediately returned because she did not like living there. Kelly liked the French name Marie Janet, and she could embellish the story of her early life. Moreover, neither confirming nor refuting documentary evidence has been preserved. Author Tony Williams, in his Ankle Jack of 2005, states that according to the census of 1881, Kelly returned to Brimbo near Wrexham, Wales. According to Joey Barnett, a neighbor of the Kelly family, Jonathan Davis, could have married Mary Jane when she was 16 years old. This assumption contradicts the fact that Kelly's husband died 2 or 3 years later, and Davis was alive in 1891, which showed the inscription. Therefore, he could not be Kelly's husband. In any case, it is unlikely that Barnett's information coincides with the facts about the Kelly family's residence in Brimbo in 1881st year, since Brimbo is located in Denbighshire County, and not near Martin or Carnarvon, and her father's name was Hubert, and not John. The assumption that the diaries of Sir John Williams served as the basis for Tony Williams' research were changed in any case call into question the whole theory. Reports in the London press that Kelly was a mother give some of the reparologists grounds to assume that young Davis was born between 1879th and 1882nd years, however. This story contains several factual errors, including the statement that they lived on the second floor. It is possible that initially, thanks to rumors, journalists considered Lizzie Fisher or Fraser, who really lived on the second floor, to be the victim. She had a 12-year-old son. According to some reports, Kelly was known by the nickname White Emma. Why she was given such a nickname is unknown. Because of her blonde hair, skin color, her beauty, or her other qualities. Some newspapers wrote that she was called Red because of her supposedly red hair. Although there is no agreement among the sources on this issue, as a result, the answer to the question about the color of her hair is in a wide range, ranging from light ash to dark brown. Other newspapers wrote that she was called Mary McCarthy, by the name of the landlady of the apartment in which she lived at the time of her death. She gravitated to the poorer East End neighborhood and reportedly lived with a man named Morganstone, near the gauze works in the Degree district, and later with a plasterer named Joe Fleming. When Kelly was drunk, she sang Irish songs, was often quarrelsome, and even insulted others, thanks to which she was nicknamed Gloomy Mary. McCarthy said she was very quiet when she was sober, but after drinking she became noisy. Barnett first met Kelly in April of 1887. The next day they met again and decided to live together. At the beginning of 1888, they moved into a furnished room at Miller Square 1336. The room was shaped like a 12-foot square. It had a bed, 3 tables, and a chair. A copy of De Fisherman's Widow hung over the fireplace. Kelly had lost her door key and was opening and closing the door by sticking her hand through the broken glass next to the door. Kelly's neighbor, German Julia Winterney, said that Kelly herself broke the window when she was drunk. Barnett worked as a loader at Billingsgate Fish Market, but soon lost his job and Kelly returned to prostitution. On October 30th, a week before his death, Barnett moved out because there was an argument with another prostitute. Barnett only knew her first name, Julia. At the same time, Barnett continued to visit Kelly. The last time Barnett visited Kelly was between 19 and 20 o'clock on the 8th of November. Barnett saw her in the company of her friend Maria Harvey. Harvey and Barnett left at the same time. Barnett returned to his room, where he played cards with the other inhabitants until he went to bed at 1:30 in the morning. Mary Ann Cox, a prostitute who lived at Miller Square, who described herself as an unhappy widow, stated that she saw a drunk Kelly returning home around 11:45 in the company of a fat red-haired man in a bowler hat, with a can of beer. Cox and Kelly said good night to each other. Kelly went to her room with the man, after which her song came from there. She was still singing when Cox left the house at midnight, and when she returned after 1 in the morning. Elizabeth Proiter, who lived in the room above Kelly, testified that when she went to bed at 1:30, the singing stopped. Laborer George Hutchinson, who knew Kelly, testified that he met her around 2 o'clock in the morning. She asked him for a loan of 6 pence. He claimed that he had lent her money, and that when Kelly went on, a man of Jewish appearance approached her. Hutchinson later gave the police a very detailed description of the man's appearance, even mentioning the color of his eyes. He testified that he heard them talking on the street in front of the courthouse where Kelly lived. She complained that she had lost her handkerchief, and the man gave her one of his red handkerchiefs. Hutchinson stated that Kelly and the man went to her room. He followed them and never saw them again, and at 45 he stopped his observations. Laundress Sarah Lewis partially confirmed Hutchinson's testimony, stating that when she went into the building at 2:30 to spend the night with the killers, her friends, she saw a man watching the entrance to the Millerscourt building. Hutchinson said he suspected this man, although it seemed that Kelly knew him, since he looked quite unusual for this area, with his rich appearance. But he reported this to the police only when the investigation into the Kelly case was hastily completed. Detective Frederick Eberlein, who led the investigation, believed that Hutchinson's information was very important, and sent police officers with him to point out the man. If she sees him again. Hutchinson's name no longer appeared in the surviving police records. Therefore, it is impossible to say with certainty whether his proof has been definitively confirmed, refuted, or discarded. Chief Inspector Walter Dew, in his memoirs, does not take into account Hutchinson's testimony on the basis that he saw it on another day, and not on the night before the murder. The head of the Criminal Investigation Department, Robert Anderson, later said that the only witness who gave an accurate description of the killer was a Jew. Some modern researchers believe that Hutchinson himself was Jack the Ripper and tried to confuse the police with a false description of the criminal. Others believe he wanted to draw attention to a story he planned to sell to the press. Cox came home at 3 in the morning. She testified that she didn't hear a sound or see a light in Kelly's room. Elizabeth Brighter, who was woken up by a kitten walking on her neck, and Sarah Lewis testified that they heard a faint murder scream at 4 in the morning, but did not react to it, since such screams were often heard in the West End. She stated that she was asleep, and during the night she heard people coming in and out of the courthouse. She thought she heard someone leaving the building at 5:45. Frater left the building at 5:30 to drink rum at the T-Bell's brothel, and did not see anything suspicious. On the morning of the 9th of November, 1888, on the annual day of the Lord Mayor, the landlord John McCarthy sent his assistant, a retired soldier Thomas Bowyer, to collect the rent. Kelly hasn't paid her rent in 6 weeks. The total amount owed was 29 shillings. After 10:45, Bowyer knocked on her door, but no one answered. He peered through the crack of the window, pushing aside the coat that was used as a curtain, looked into the room, and saw Kelly's monstrously mutilated body lying on the bed. The Manchester Guardian newspaper, in the issue of November 10, 1888, reported that Sergeant Edward Betham and Inspector Walter Beck went to Millerscourt 13 as soon as the terrified Bowyer informed them about the murder. Beek stated that he was the senior police officer here, and Beek could accompany him. But there shouldn't be any records left to prove that Betham was with him. On November 12th, Betham was supposed to go to a police post on Commercial Street. The investigation into the Kelly case was completed on the same day around 6 o'clock in the evening. George Hutchinson came to the post to give his testimony to Betham. The wife of the owner of a local flop house, Caroline Maxwell, stated that she saw Kelly alive at 8:30 on the morning of the murder, although she admitted that she had only met Kelly once or twice before. Moreover, her testimony did not coincide with the testimony of those who were closely acquainted with Kelly. Maurice Lewis, a tailor, claimed to have seen Kelly in a pub at 10 that morning. The police dismissed both of these statements because they went against the established time of death. In addition, there was no one who would confirm these statements. Maxwell could have made a mistake, or made a mistake with the day he saw Kelly. This confusion became part of the plot of the novel From Hell and subsequent film incarnations. Superintendent Thomas Arnold and Whitechapel Division Inspector Edmund Reith, Frederick Eberlein, and Robert Anderson from Scotland Yard also visited the murder scene. Arnold established that the room had been broken into at 1:30. after which the possibility of putting bloodhounds on the trail of the killer was rejected as impractical. Traces of a strong fire were found in the fireplace, sufficient to melt the solder connecting the spout of the kettle to its body. Inspector Eberline suggested that the killer burned Kelly's clothes to get light, since there was only one candle burning in the room. Doctors Thomas Bond and George Baxter Phillips examined the body and determined that death occurred 12 hours before the investigation. Phillips suggested that the killer spent 2 hours on his actions over the body. Bond noticed that rigor mortis indicated a time of death between 2 and 8 o'clock. Bond's remark read, "The naked body lies in the middle of the bed. The shoulders lie straight, but the body itself is shifted to the left side of the bed. The head is turned to the left cheek. The left arm is pressed against the body. The forearm is bent to the right and lies across the abdominal cavity. The right hand lies on the flight from the body, on the mattress. The arm is bent at the elbow, the forearm is relaxed, the fingers are clenched, the legs lie apart. The left one is bent at the knee joint and pressed against the trunk. The right leg forms an obtuse angle with the pubic bone. The entire surface of the abdominal cavity and thighs are cut off. The entrails were removed from the abdominal cavity. The breasts were cut off, the arms were mutilated by several uneven wounds, the face was hacked beyond recognition. The tissues of the throat are cut to the very bones. The entrails were found in various places, namely, the uterus and kidneys together with one breast under the head, the other breast under the right foot, the liver between the legs, the intestines on the right side, and the spleen to the left of the body. The surface of the abdominal cavity and thighs lies on the table. The bedclothes in the right corner were soaked with blood. The floor is 2 square feet soaked in blood. The wall on the right side of the bed on the throat line is stained with blood in several places. The face is cut with deep wounds in all directions. Nose, cheeks, eyebrows, and ears are partially cut off. The lips are pale and dissected by several incisions running obliquely to the chin. There are also numerous incisions made randomly in all places. The throat is cut to the vertebrae. Notches were found on the 5th and 6th. Bruises are clearly visible on the skin near the throat. The air tube is cut in the lower part of the trachea at the cricoid cartilage. Both breasts are cut off by circular incisions of the rib muscles too. Intercostal muscles of the 4th, 5th, and 6th ribs are dissected. Through the incisions, the insides of the chest are visible. The skin and tissue from the abdomen, from the costal arch to the pubis, were removed and cut into 3 pieces. The right thigh is cut from the front to the bone. A piece of skin, including the external genitals and part of the right buttock. From the left thigh, the length has skin and muscles all the way to the knee. There is not a deep wound on the left mountain, passing through the skin and tissues to the deep-lying muscles. It starts 5 inches above the ankle and stretches to the knee. There are extensive lacerations on both arms and forearms. A superficial incision 1 inch deep and a subcutaneous hematoma are visible on the thumb of the right hand. There are several abrasions on the back of the hand. Upon opening the chest, it was found that the right lung was minimally filled due to the presence of old persistent adhesions. The lower part of the lung was torn off and removed. The left lung remained intact. A spike was found on the top of the lung and several on the back. There were several hard nodules in the lung tissue itself. The pericardial sac was dissected from below. The heart is missing. Partially digested pieces of food, fish and potatoes were found in the abdominal cavity. Similar food residues were found in the remains of the stomach attached to the intestines. Phillips believed that Kelly was killed after her throat was cut, and the injuries were inflicted later. Bond indicated in the report that the knife used by the killer was 25 millimeters wide, and no more than 150 millimeters long, and that the killer did not have medical knowledge and skills. He wrote, "The injuries were inflicted by a person who clearly has no scientific or anatomical knowledge. I think he's a criminal. He didn't even have the skills of a butcher or a slaughterer of horses or a person trained to butcher animal carcasses." The body was sent to the morgue in Shoreditch, not Whitechapel. This meant that the investigation would be opened by Dr. Roderick MacDonald. The coroner of Northeast Middlesex, not Win Edward Baxter. The coroner who conducted most of the investigations into the other Whitechapel murders. The speed of the investigation has caused criticism from the press. MacDonald held a hearing on the case in one day on November 12 at Shoreditch Town Hall. The body was officially identified by Barnett, who stated that he identified the victim by the ear and eyes. McCarthy was also sure it was Kelly's body. The death certificate was registered on November 17 in the name of Mary Janet Kelly Davis. Kelly was buried on November 19, 1888, in a common grave at St. Patrick's Catholic Cemetery. The number of her grave is 66 row 66, 10th Precinct. Her obituary said the funeral of the murdered woman, Kelly, has been postponed. The deceased was a Catholic, and Barnett, with whom she lived, and her landlady, Mrs. Emcart, wanted the ritual of the church to which she belonged to be performed over her remains. Therefore, the funeral took place the next day, November 19, at the Catholic Cemetery in Leytonstone. The coffin stayed at Shoreditch Morgue until 12:30. The remains of Mary Janet Kelly, murdered on November 9 at the Miller Courthouse on Dorset Street, Spitalfields. They were sent yesterday morning from Shoreditch Mortuary to Leytonstone, where they were interred. None of her relatives were ever found to invite them to the funeral. Kelly's grave was ennobled in the 1950s. John Morrison had a big white tombstone set up on it, but he put it on the wrong grave. The gravestone was later removed. In the 1990s, the superintendent marked Kelly's grave with an ordinary monument. The police conducted extensive house-to-house searches and searches. On November 10, Dr. Bond released a report linking Kelly's murder to the previous four: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Straight, and Catherine Eddowes, and described a possible profile of the killer. On the same day, the government announced a pardon for any accomplice who did not take part in the plot or commission of the murder, whose information and testimony will lead to the exposure and conviction of the murderer or murderers. Despite this proposal and a massive police investigation, neither the accused nor the defendants were found. Over the next 6 months, no similar crimes occurred, which led to a gradual curtailment of the police investigation. Keller is regarded by most as the last victim of Jack the Ripper. It is assumed that the series of crimes came to an end with the death, imprisonment in a psychiatric hospital, or emigration of the criminal. The disfigurement of Kelly's body was the most horrific in a series of Whitechapel murders, perhaps because the killer had a lot of time to commit his atrocities while in a private room and not on the street. Kelly was undressed. There were some details of her clothes on the chair. This has led to speculation that she undressed before going to bed. This shows that she was killed by someone she knew, or by someone she thought was a client, or when she was asleep or was in an insensible state after libations. Aberline interrogated Kelly's lover, Joey Barnett, for hours after the murder. His clothes were examined for blood. Barnett was released without charge. Centuries later, authors Paul Harrison and Bruce Paley suggested that Kelly was killed by Barnett out of jealousy, or because she neglected him. The authors suggested that Barnett committed other crimes to frighten Kelly and discourage her from the streets and prostitution. Other authors suggest that Barnett only killed Kelly and mutilated her body to make her look like a victim of Jack the Ripper. The Eberline investigation exonerated Barnett. Other acquaintances of Kelly were also among the suspects, including landlord John McCarthy and her former lover Joseph Fleming. Writer Mark Daniel suggested that Kelly's killer was a religious maniac who killed her as a ritual sacrifice, and that traces of fire appeared in the hearth because the killer needed not light, but a burnt offering. William Stewart, in 1939, suggested that Kelly was killed by a deranged midwife, Jill the Ripper, to whom Kelly turned to have an abortion. According to Stewart, The killer burned her clothes in the fireplace because she was soaked in blood and escaped by wearing Kelly's clothes. That's why Mrs. Maxwell said she saw Kelly the morning after the murder. In fact, she saw the killer in Kelly's clothes. However, the medical reports, which were unavailable at the time Stewart compiled his story, do not contain even a hint of Kelly's pregnancy, and the whole theory is entirely based on fiction. Some modern authors consider it possible that Kelly was not the victim of a criminal who committed a series of Whitechapel murders. She was only 25 years old, and she was younger than the other victims, who were in their 40s. The killer mutilated her body much more than the bodies of other victims. She was the only victim killed indoors, not outdoors. 5 weeks had passed from the time of the previous murders to her death. After Bowyer reported the murder, the police did not immediately enter Kelly's room. Sir Charles Warren, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, has issued an order that if another murder occurs, no one should disturb the crime scene until he personally arrives there to lead the investigation. However, on the eve of Warren was removed from the post of commissioner. The police didn't know about it and waited until 12:45. 2 hours passed after Bowyer's statement until the news of Warren's resignation was received. It was widely reported in the press that Warren hoped to put bloodhounds on the trail of the killer, and did not want anyone to appear at the crime scene until the dogs were brought there. In addition to the 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper, there are other victims whose names many often associate with the activities of a maniac. Among these victims are the following women. Rose Milett on Thursday, December 20th, 1888, a constable patrolling the area, found a 29-year-old prostitute, Rose Milett, who lived at 18 George Street under the name of Emma Smith, strangled in Clark's Yard on Poplar High Street. 4 doctors who examined Milett's body concluded that she had been killed, but Robert Anderson believed that she could have accidentally hanged herself from the collar of her own dress while in a state of strong intoxication. At Anderson's request, Dr. Bond examined Milett's body and agreed with Anderson's opinion. Commissioner Munro also suspected that it was suicide or natural death, as there were no signs of a struggle. Coroner Baxter also concluded and informed the jury that in the case of Rose Milett, there was no evidence to indicate that the death was the result of violence. However, the jury called Milett's death a premeditated murder committed by an unknown person or group of people, and the case was added to the other Whitechapel cases of Alice Mackenzie, a probable prostitute of 40 years, who lived at number 52 on Gann Street, was killed around 12:40 on Wednesday, July 17, 1889, in the Castle Alley of Whitechapel. As with most previous murders, Mackenzie's throat was cut from left to right. The carotid artery on the left was also damaged, and there were wounds on the abdomen. The wounds were not as deep as those of the previous victims and were most likely inflicted with a shorter blade. Commissioner Munro and pathologist Thomas Bond, who examined the body, believed that this murder was the work of Jack the Ripper, although there were opponents of this version. Pathologist George Baxter Phillips, First Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police Robert Anderson, and Inspector Aberline. Later, the opinion of researchers was divided. Some assumed that Mackenzie was the victim of the Ripper, others considered the copycat killer, who wanted to divert suspicion from himself. During the investigation, Coroner Baxter accepted both versions, concluding that there were great similarities between this and other cases that occurred in the area. The torso of Spinchin Street. The woman's torso was discovered at 5:15 in the morning of September 10, 1889th year. The gift of the railway bridge on Pincher Street, Whitechapel. The surrounding area was thoroughly searched, but no other body parts could be found. The identity of the deceased, whose age at the time of death was about 30–40 years, has not been established. The cause of death was also not established. according to the conclusion of the Chief Inspector of Scotland Yard, Donald Swanson, and Commissioner James Munro, who investigated the case. The cause of the woman's death could not be either blood loss from multiple stab wounds or throat cutting. Jack the Ripper's business card. Since there was blood in the body of the deceased, pathologists, on the contrary, noted a low blood content in the tissues and vessels of the body and concluded that the woman died due to blood loss. The newspapers published the assumption that the body belonged to the missing Lydia Hart, but it was refuted when Hart was found alive in one of the hospitals after having too much fun. Also, the assumption was not confirmed that the victim was a missing girl named Emily Barker, since the body found belonged to a woman who was older and taller. Inspector Swanson did not consider this murder to be the work of Jack the Ripper and suggested that it was connected with other cases of dismembered bodies being found in the London boroughs of Rain, Chelsea, and Westminster. The body found on the Victoria Embankment in Westminster on October 2, 1888, was also called the Whitehall Mystery because of its proximity to the street of the same name. Commissioner Munro agreed with Swanson's opinion. Behind these 4 murders, presumably, was a serial killer nicknamed the Dismemberer, whose identity has remained unknown, and who could be either Jack the Ripper or another related or unrelated person. The torsos of Spinchin Street were also linked to 3 other murders of women, two known as the Battersea Mystery, committed in 1873-74 years, and one committed on Tottenham Court Road in 1884 year. Many researchers of the murders committed by Jack the Ripper exclude the possibility that the Whitechapel killer and the dismemberer are the same person because of the difference in the handwriting of the crime. Francis Cole's, the last case of the Whitechapel murders, was the death under the railway arch, on February 13, 1891, of a 25-year-old prostitute, Frances Coles, who lived in White's Row. Her body was found by P.C. Ernest Thompson just minutes after the attack on her, at 2:15 in the morning in the Swallow Gardens. The body was lying in the passage under the railway arch between Chamber Street and Royal Mine Street in Whitechapel. Small wounds on the back of the head indicated that the victim was abruptly thrown to the ground before her throat was cut, at least twice, from left to right and then from right to left. No other injuries were found. Superintendent Thomas Arnold and Inspector Reed arrived shortly after the discovery of the body from the nearby Lyman Street police station. Chief Inspector Swanson and Henry Moore, who had been involved in previous homicide investigations, arrived at 5 in the morning. A man named James Thomas Sadler, who was seen with Coles earlier, was arrested by police and charged with her murder. Swanson and Moore thoroughly investigated Adler's alibi at the time of the previous murders, which indicated that he was considered as a man hiding under the guise of Jack the Ripper. However, Sadler was released on March 3 due to lack of evidence of his guilt. At the time of the murders at Whitechapel, letters allegedly from Jack the Ripper were received in the editorial offices of local newspapers. In total, 3 such letters were received. A letter to the boss. The letter was dated September 25, stamped on September 27, 1888, by the Central News Agency and delivered to Scotland Yard on September 29. The text of the letter was as follows: Citizen Chief, I keep hearing that the police were following me, but they can't determine my location yet. I laugh when they look so smart and talk about being on the right track. I was convulsing from that joke about the leather apron. I'm running out of whores, but I'm not going to stop gutting them until I get arrested after all. The last job was just gorgeous. I didn't give that girl a chance to make a sound. How can they catch me? I love what I do, and I want to continue. Soon you will hear about me and my funny pranks. From the last time there was some red liquid left in the ginger beer bottle to write to her. But it has become as thick as glue, and I can't use it. I hope the red ink will do. Ha ha. Next time I'll cut off the girl's ears and send them to the police just for fun. Save this letter while I'm busy with work, and then I'll make it public in full. My knife is so nice and sharp that I would get down to business immediately if I had the opportunity. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. With your permission, under a pseudonym. Postscript. I am not sending this letter until I have taken all the red paste from my hands to her. So far to no avail. Now they say I'm a doctor. Ha ha. Initially it was considered a joke, but when the body of Catherine Edis was found on September 30th, her ear was partially cut off. The investigators' attention was attracted by the fact that in a letter written at least 3 days before the murder, there was a phrase, "to cut off the girl's ears." On the 1st of October, a letter was published in the newspapers. The police hoped that someone would be able to recognize the handwriting, but this did not help the investigation. It was the first letter signed with the name of Jack the Ripper, and after its publication, hundreds of letters allegedly from the Ripper began to arrive. Most of the letters copied the text of this particular message, despite the publication of the letter. The police soon officially declared the message a fake of a local journalist. This statement was not widely accepted, and the letters to the police have firmly entered the public consciousness. As part of the Ripper case, scientists and the following circumstances of the Ripper case are divided into those who consider the letters to be fake, and those who believe in the authenticity of the messages. The latter sometimes use letters to prove the identity of the maniac by comparing the handwriting on the letter and the suspect. Like many other clues related to the Jack the Ripper case, the letter was lost from the police archives. It is believed that it could have been taken by someone connected with the investigation as a souvenir, but in 1988, it was anonymously sent to the police department. Presumably, the family of the policeman who took the letter a century before. In 1993, the handwriting of the letter "Dear Boss" was compared with the handwriting of the alleged diary of James Maybrick, a cotton merchant from Liverpool. He was considered as one of the suspects in the Ripper case. The report notes that the writing style of the letter characters is closely related to the writing style of that time, and demonstrates good writing skills. In the 2018 year, a forensic linguist from the University of Manchester named Andrea Nini declared her conviction that both the letter of the Dear Boss and the postcard of the Daring Jackie were written by the same person. Commenting on her findings, Dr. Nini stated, "I have come to the conclusion that there is very strong linguistic evidence that these two texts were written by the same person. People in the past have already made this preliminary conclusion based on the similarity of handwriting, but it has not been established with complete certainty." Cheeky Jackie's postcard is stamped with the date October 1st, 1888, and on the night of September 30th, Elizabeth Straight and Catherine Eddowes were killed. There is a possibility that the letter was sent immediately after the murders, but the postmark indicating that the letter arrived at the post office more than a day after the murder of the women gives reason to believe that the postcard could have been written much later, when some of the circumstances of the crimes could already be found out by journalists. The text of the postcard read as follows: "I was not lying, dear boss, when I said that you will hear about work tomorrow, Cheeky Jack. Now two." One of them screamed a little, couldn't kill right away. There was no time to cut off the ears for the police. Thank you for saving the last email before I went to work. Jack the Ripper, the handwriting in which the message is written, is similar to the handwriting of the previously sent letter, Dear Boss. It is believed that the phrase in the postcard, now 2 hints that the 2 victims were killed close to each other, and soon one after the other. This was enough for the police to decide to publish the image of the postcard again, hoping that someone would recognize the author's handwriting. Later, police officers claimed that they had identified the journalist as the author of the hoaxes, who, according to their statement, is also the author of the Dear Boss letter. As in the case of the letter Dear Boss, the postcard was stolen a few years later from the police archive. But, unlike the letter to the boss, the Cheeky Jackie's postcard was not returned. Among the many letters that allegedly came from Jack the Ripper, at the time when the Whitechapel murders took place, researchers single out a letter from hell as one of those that could actually have been written by a serial killer. This letter is not signed with the pseudonym Jack the Ripper, like the previous 2. Also, the letter from hell is written much more illiterate than the 2 letters mentioned above. Stamped on October 15, 1888, the letter was received by George Lusk from the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee the next day. The reason why this letter stands out among all similar letters is that it was delivered in a small box, which, in addition to the letter, contained half of the kidney stored in ethanol. Later it was found that the kidney is human. The kidney of one of the victims, Catherine Edis, was removed by the killer. There is a medical opinion that the kidney could have been extracted from another corpse by medical students and sent along with the letter as a dark hoax. The text of the letter reads, "From hell. Mr. Lusk, sir, I am sending you half of a kidney that I took from one of the women and saved for you. I fried the other half and ate it. She tasted delicious. I'll send you the bloody knife I used to cut her out if you wait any longer. Signed. Try to stop me, Mr. Lusk." The original letter, as well as half of the kidney that was sent with it, was lost along with other items related to the Jack the Ripper case. It is possible that the letter, or both the letter and the kidney, were taken by persons related to the investigation as souvenirs. Hundreds of letters claiming to have been written by the killer were published during the Ripper murders. But many researchers claim that the letter from hell is one of several possibly genuine letters received to the killer. Its author did not sign it with the pseudonym Jack the Ripper, which distinguished it from the earlier letter, Dear Boss, and the postcard of Cheeky Jackie, as well as from many of their imitators. The handwriting is also similar in the 2 previous messages, but different from hell. The letter was delivered to Lask personally, without reference to the police or the British government, which may indicate hostility to Lask or the local Whitechapel community of which he was a member. The letter from hell is written at a much lower level of literacy than the other 2. It has a lot of spelling and grammar errors. Scientists are debating whether this is a deliberate misdirection, since the author has replaced the way of writing some letters in part of the words. The formatting of the letter is also characterized by a cramped writing style in which letters are randomly connected. Many ink spots appear in such a way that it may indicate that the writer did not know how to use a pen. The formatting of the message may indicate that it is a deception of a well-educated person. But some researchers claim that this is the genuine work of a physically healthy but deranged person. The opinions of those who considered the case were divided. It has been suggested that all the messages, presumably from the Whitechapel killer, are fraudulent acts committed by cranks or journalists seeking to further increase the madness in the media. Scotland Yard had reason to doubt the validity of the letter, but in the end it took no action against the suspected journalists. However, many differences between the letter from hell and the vast majority of the messages received were quoted by some figures analyzing the case, such as a forensic handwriting expert who gave an interview to the History Channel, and another who gave an interview to the Discovery Channel, explained that most likely the letter from hell is the only letter written by the killer. The murders in London's Whitechapel in 1888 were committed by an unidentified serial killer or killers, who later became known as Jack the Ripper. Since that moment, the debate about the identity of the villain has not subsided, and in total, about 100 people have been proposed as suspects. The documents of the Metropolitan Police Service indicate that the investigation conducted by detectives included checking 11 murders of women that occurred in the period from 1,888,800 of them. The so-called canonical victims Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Straight, Catherine Eddles, and Mary Jane Kelly are generally recognized, and the other 6 Emma Elizabeth Smith, Martha Tabram, Rose Mallet, Alice Mackenzie, Frances Coles, and an unidentified woman are named as possible. The rapidity of the attacks and the damage to the victims' bodies suggested that the killer could have had the skills of a doctor or a butcher. However, not all experts agreed with this. Some agreed that the wounds inflicted by the killer were too rough and were not professional cuts. Local butchers and executioners were checked and excluded from the lists of suspects. In total, about 2,000 people were interviewed, and about 80 were detained, but the murder charges were never brought against any of them. Montague John Druid, lawyer and part-time assistant school teacher in 1888th year, was dismissed, and a little later his body was found in the Thames. Presumably the Druid was homosexual, which is why I lost my job, which in turn pushed him to suicide. It is also known that the Druid's mother and grandmother suffered from mental disorders, the appearance of symptoms of which the Druid could also cause his dismissal from school. His death shortly after the murder of the 5th canonical victim attracted the attention of Chief Constable Sir Melvin Macnaghten, who in 1894 named the Druid as the main suspect in this case. The Druid's innocence is supported by the fact that a day after the first canonical murder, the Druid was seen playing cricket in Dorsetty, as well as the fact that the Druid lived on the other side of the Thames in Graffiti, Kent. The killer was believed to have lived in Whitechapel at the time of the crimes. Later, Inspector Frederick Aberline excluded the Druid from the list of prime suspects. The only fact in favor of the Druid's guilt was that the murders of Whitechapel stopped with the death of the suspect. And, perhaps, the suicide of the Druid himself would have ended the series of murders of Jack the Ripper, if Montague John Druid had been him. Severin Antonovich Klasovsky, also known as George Chapman, has no relation to Kenny Chapman, a Polish emigrant who came to England sometime between 1887–1888 years, shortly before the murders began in 1893 or 1894 year. Took the surname Chapman, successively poisoned 3 of his wives, and was hanged in 1903 year. Already under the name George Chapman, at the time of the murders, he lived in Whitechapel, where he worked as a hairdresser. Adam, who wrote a book about English poisoners in 1930. He mentioned that Inspector Frederick Aberline suspected Klasovsky of the Ripper murders, but it was not possible to get a confession from Klasovsky himself. Klasovsky's innocence is supported by the fact that he was a poisoner, and in order to kill prostitutes at Whitechapel, he would have to radically change the methods of murder, which is unlikely. Aaron Mortki Kosminski is a Polish Jew who was admitted to the Kolny Hatch lunatic asylum and scrapped in 1891st year without a personal name and under the surname Kosminski. Chief Constable Sir Melvin McNacton considered Kosminski one of the main suspects, as did Chief Inspector Donaldson. Assistant Commissioner Sir Robert Anderson wrote in his memoirs that Kosminski was allegedly caught at the scene of one of the crimes. But another witness, who also turned out to be Jewish, refused to testify against him. In turn, McNacton said that no one had ever been detained at the police crime scenes, which contradicts Anderson's recollections. Also, there is not a single document related to this case left in the documents of the London police. In articles and printed publications, it is Aaron Kosminski who is most often called Jack the Ripper. Well-known FBI profiler John Douglas said that if Aaron Kosminski is not Jack the Ripper, the real criminal looks like him. The version that Aaron Kosminski was the killer was confirmed in the 2014 year by DNA analysis from semen stains found by one of the victims, Catherine Edis. The study was conducted by Associate Professor of Molecular Biology from the University of Liverpool Jari Lohelainen. He took the molecules needed for the tests from a shawl found near the body of Catherine Edis, one of Jack the Ripper's victims. This shawl, which as it turned out, was never washed, was provided by businessman Russell Edwards, who bought it at auction. According to the businessman, one of the policemen who worked at the murder scene took the handkerchief home for his wife. As a result of careful analyses, Dr. Lohelainen, who compared samples with shawls and DNA of the victims' relatives, as well as suspects, came to the conclusion that Jack the Ripper, on whose account was a Polish emigrant Aaron Kosminski. He was 23 years old at the time of the commission of the first crimes in 1888. According to the scientist, the serial killer worked as a hairdresser in the London borough of Whitechapel, where in his spare time he dealt with the victims, first cutting their throats and then ripping open their stomach. Kosminski was one of the suspects in the brutal murders, but the police were never able to prove his guilt. Later, Kosminski, who was also on trial for trying to stab his sister, was declared mentally ill and sent for compulsory treatment to a Brighton clinic, then spending the rest of his life in clinics. The murders were not repeated after his imprisonment. Michael Ostrich, also known as Dr. Grant, Bertrand Ashley, Claude Clayton, Catton, Ashley Nabokov, Orlov, Count Sobieski, allegedly a Russian fraudster, whose real origin and name have never been established. He used numerous aliases and guises. Ostrich himself claimed to have served as a surgeon on a Russian Navy ship, which has never been confirmed or refuted. Sir Melvin McNacton included Ostrich in the list of suspects, but the investigation was unable to establish whether the island committed crimes more serious than theft and fraud. Later, writer Philippe Segin found prison records indicating that Ostrov was imprisoned in France at the time of the murders. The last mention of the prison dates back to 1904 year. Then the traces of the fraudster are lost. John Pazer is a Polish Jew who worked as a shoemaker in Whitechapel. After the murders of Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman in late August and early September of 1888, respectively, on September 10, 1888, Police Sergeant William Tick arrested Pazer. John Pazer had the nickname Leather Apron and was previously suspected of beating Whitechapel prostitutes. In the early days of the murders, many locals suspected that Leather Apron was the killer, although the police found no evidence of Paiser's involvement in the murders. All suspicions were cleared when Paiser's alibi was established at the time of the two murders. John Paiser and William Thicke knew each other before the arrest. Thicke had arrested Paiser several times, so Paiser claimed that Thicke hated him. Eventually, Paiser was released, and also received monetary compensation for moral damage from one of the newspapers, which called him Jack the Ripper. James Thomas Sadler, the sailor James Thomas Sadler, was acquainted with Francis Coles, who was not included in the list of 5 canonical victims. Coles was murdered on February 13, 1891. Sadler was arrested, but no evidence of his guilt was found. In addition, Sadler was at sea at all during some of the murders. According to McNaughton, James Thomas Sadler was a rowdy and a drunkard with an uncontrollable temper, but not a murderer. Francis Tumblety is an American fraudster and misogynist. Irish by birth. He pretended to be a doctor and sold proprietary medicines of his own production. After the death of one of his patients in Boston, Tumblety fled from persecution. In 1865 year, he was arrested on suspicion of complicity in the murder of Abraham Lincoln, but later released. After his divorce from his wife, he was repeatedly seen in the society of homosexuals. At the time of the murders, Tumblety was in London, from where he fled to France, and later back to the United States. Scotland Yard later sent a request for Tumblety's extradition back to England, but the NYPD considered that there was no evidence of Tumblety's involvement in the Whitechapel murders. Walter Richard Secret. In various theories about the identity of Jack the Ripper, the artist Walter Secret has been repeatedly considered. For example, in 1976 by Stephen Knight, and in 2002 by Patricia Cornwell. The latter insists that in his paintings, the artist depicted details of the crime unknown to the public at that time. However, most researchers do not support Secret's identification with the killer. In 1905, the painter returned to England from the city of Dieppe in France, where he lived for a long time. After a scandalous divorce from his wife from 1898 to 1905. He rented an apartment in the London borough of Camden Town. At that time, it was a poor working-class neighborhood, dysfunctional and unsafe. Secret confirmed his membership in the New English Art Club, where Impressionism prevailed. He did not take part in its activities while living in France. Soon Secret became interested in more radical artistic trends in painting. He exhibited his works at the Avant-Garde Autumn Salon in Paris. He initiated the creation of the Fitzroy Street Group, which got its name from the street where Secret's workshop was located. On Thursdays, its participants gathered in this workshop, among whom the artists Spencer Gore and Harold Gilman were already known at that time. The painting Jack the Ripper's Bedroom was painted by the artist in 1908 year in his apartment. Technique of execution: oil painting on canvas, size 50.8 by 40.6 centimeters. In the early 20s of the 20th century, Secret painted a young artist, Cecily Hay. He gave her a painting of Jack the Ripper's bedroom. Until that time, it was the property of the artist himself. But it is not known exactly where the painting was from 1908, when it was painted, until that time. The artist was not in the habit of advertising some of his paintings. In 1980, Jack the Ripper's Bedroom was bequeathed to the Manchester Art Gallery. The painting Jack the Ripper's Bedroom has been in the gallery's storerooms for 22 years. It is still missing from the official website of the museum, where other paintings and drawings of the artist are presented. In a large article by the art critic of the British Tate Gallery dedicated to the Camp Dentown series of paintings by the artist, the painting is also not mentioned, but her analysis is present in Matthew Sturge's book Walter Secret, Biography. In 1976, Stephen Knight, in his book Jack the Ripper, The Final Conclusion, claimed that Secret was forced to become an accomplice in the Ripper murders. He received the information from a certain Joseph Gorman, who claimed to be Secret's illegitimate son. Gorman later admitted to lying. In 1990, Jane Overton Fuller, in her book The Secret and the Crime of the Ripper, already claimed that the Secret himself was a murderer. The hypothesis arose again among a number of researchers in the early years of the 21st century, on the basis of comparing a series of several gloomy paintings similar in content and atmosphere and preparatory drawings for them, written by Sickert in 1909 with the circumstances of the murders of 1888. The paintings depicted naked women, some alive and others possibly dead. And next to them is a man who, as it was assumed, is their killer. The series was called The Murder in Camden Town, after the name of the metropolitan area where the artist lived, and in which the prostitute Emily Dim Mock was also killed in 1907 year. Some of these paintings were titled Murder in Camden Town by the artist himself, while each one individually has a different name. For example, What Should We Do to Pay the Rent? It was noticed that in the Camden Town paintings, some details of the interior items of the lying women's poses resemble the reports of police and medical experts on the crimes of Jack the Ripper, which had not yet become public at that time. And therefore, only the killers could be known. Psychologists say that serial killers are trying to keep a certain object in memory of the crime committed. Sickert's paintings in this case can be perceived as an analogue of a similar habit. In the year 2012, a large scientific article by an English art critic, an employee of the British Tate Gallery, appeared in which the paintings of this series were subjected to a detailed analysis. But Jack the Ripper's bedroom is not mentioned in it and does not even relate to this series. At the beginning of the 2002 year, Howard Smith, curator of the Manchester Art Gallery, turned to the writer Patricia Cornwell, who was interested in the problem of Jack the Ripper's personality, and was preparing for publication the book Jack the Ripper, Who Is He? Portrait of the Killer. He wanted to know if she knew that in 1908 year, the artist Sickert, in addition to the already well-known paintings of the Camden Town cycle, also painted a picture in the bedroom of Jack the Ripper, which at that time did not correlate with the artist's Camden Town series and was poorly known even to specialists. In 1980, when the painting was transferred to the gallery, according to Cornwell, the curator Julian Trey-Hurst informed the Doctor of Art History Professor Wendy Boren, a specialist in the work of Sickert. We have just been presented with 2 oil paintings by Sickert. He wrote to her on the 2nd of September, 1980. The Baron answered him only a month later. She claimed that the room depicted in the painting was a bedroom in a house in Camden Town, where Sickert rented the top 2 floors, after returning to London from France in 1906 year. Byrne noticed, according to Patricia Cornwell, that the house in Camden Town really, according to Sickert, was the home of Jack the Ripper in the 80s of the 19th century. Cornwell herself suggests that the artist could have had a secret hideout at this address during the commission of serial murders back then. And the official Sickert settled here at the beginning of the 20th century. In 1907, a prostitute was found a mile from his house with her throat cut, which Cornell considers another proof of Sickert's criminal tendencies. According to Patricia Cornell, Sickert later told friends that one day he settled in a house whose owner claimed that this was where Jack the Ripper lived. She considered a sickly vet student, who later ended up in a psychiatric hospital, to be a Ripper. The landlady informed Sickert of this man's Amy, and the artist wrote it down on the page of the Memoirs of the Story of My Life by Giacomo Casanova, which he was reading at the time. The book was lost during the Second World War. In 2017, Cornwell published a second book about Sickert, whom she continues to consider the Ripper. Wendy Barron included information about this painting in her book about the artist's work, but did not place her photo. which is a rare exception in her fundamental research. The version of the art critic in this book is somewhat different from the one described by Cornwell. Byrne claims that the painting depicts the interior of a ground-floor bedroom at the back of a house at Mornington Crescent 6. In her opinion, the name of the painting led to a poorly grounded theory from a scientific point of view, that the painting was Sickert's confession that he was Jack the Ripper. Barron writes that when Sickert came to this house to rent an apartment here, the landlady, a certain Mrs. Louise Jones, expressed to him her suspicions about her former tenant of this apartment, insisting that the previous tenant was Jack the Ripper. It was the usual story of a suspicious housewife. Her young tenant left in the evening on the days when crimes were committed, and returned only at dawn. After he left London, the murders allegedly stopped. She told Sickert the guest's name, which he had written on the flyleaf of a book. He later lent the book to his artist friend, Albert Daniel Rutherston, who subsequently lost it, and the name written on it was lost. The painting is painted from the point of view of an observer standing in front of open double doors, leading to a small gloomy room. In the dark mirror behind the iron bed, the vague outlines of a male figure, presumably the killer, are vaguely reflected. Interpretations of the author's idea are different. Burns believes that the artist approached the creation of the picture as a director to stage a play. The props are artfully arranged in the interior. The atmosphere prepares the viewer for a dramatic narrative that will unfold in it later. Barron suggested that the painting could have appeared first, and only then, starting from the atmosphere of this canvas. The artist came up with a name for it. Patricia Cornwell, on the other hand, insists Sickert always drew, engraved, and painted only what he saw. This is a well-known fact. He drew a cart that looks like 2 drops of water, similar to the one I saw in the Museum of the London Police. This painting is not signed, there is no date on it. The seeker wrote only, Cart, Saint, January Deep Street. The paintings of the murder series in Camden Town are always images, in which there is a clothed man and a naked woman lying on a bed. The names of paintings can be double and different, even opposite in meaning. There is no reason to unambiguously identify their plots as crimes. Each of them can be interpreted in a melodramatic sense. The presence of a naked woman and a clothed man was considered at different times by different art historians as a kind of despair or family idol, a real scene recreated by an artist at the crime scene, or his fantasies on a topic known to him from the media. The art critic notes that Sickert plays with the numata inherent in the images as a whole, and the conscious pictorial ambiguity of his own paintings. Various interpretations of the paintings allow for realistic social interpretation. Criticism of the conditions of existence of the poor, automatic writing expressing the hidden thoughts of the author, imperceptibly from his consciousness. The deliberate desire of the author to put the viewer in a dead end, and perhaps to make him an unsolvable riddle. The paintings of the series, according to Lisa Tickner, can be imagined as an area of overlap of 3 circles, each of which is a special theme of European art at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. The first of them is nude, the second is an image of prostitutes, for example, A Woman of Easy Virtue by Edgar Degas, depicted on the terrace of a cafe. The third is a murder of a mixture of nudity and a prostitute, can be most reliably represented by the Olympia of Edward Manet. The critic Walensky defended Sickert from the accusation of bad intentions. He insisted that the painting was just a technical experiment of the artist. Sickert's friend, the artist Margari Lilly, recalled that he had a favorite red neckerchief. While working on the paintings from the series and reviving the scene in his imagination, he imagined himself as a criminal, tightening a handkerchief around his neck, pulling his hat over his eyes, and lighting his lantern. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was believed that if a criminal tied a red handkerchief around his neck before execution, it meant that he had not confessed to anyone and took his secrets with him to the grave. The artist did not allow even his housekeeper to touch his red handkerchief. Sickert valued him so much that he had to see him all the time. The period of the Camden Town murder series began immediately after the murder of a prostitute in Camden Town in 1970. Lilly claimed that at this time, Sickert had two obsessions of crime and the clergy. At the beginning of the 20th century, Sickert was considered a respected artist. His familiarity with the details of crimes was usually explained by his contemporaries, by his presence at the crime scene with the permission of the police for creative purposes. On November 29, 1937, 30 years after the crime, a short article appeared in the newspaper Evening Standard about the paintings of this period. It said Sickert, who lived in Camden Town, was allowed to enter the house where the murder was committed. He made some sketches of the murdered woman. According to Cornwell, Sickert's appearance at the crime scene should have provided him with an alibi. It explained the discovery of fingerprints in the house that could have been identified as belonging to Walter Richard Sickert. Drawing dead bodies became an obsession for Sickert. During the First World War, he painted the wounded and the dead in the hospital, proudly declaring about one of them, "I managed to draw him alive and then dead." According to most historians and art historians, it is striking that the evidence collected by Patricia Cornwell is indirect and speculative. They usually interpret the paintings of this cycle as episodes from the everyday life of the London underclass. The art critic describes one of the paintings in the series as follows. Sickert's attention was drawn to the real-life tragedies that took place around him every day in the back streets of Camden Town, where selling the body was the most affordable way to earn money for poor women. The mood of the painting is not violence, but sadness and trust. Each figure is immersed in his own thoughts. The man lowered his head to his folded hands in despair. The Whitechapel murders were widely covered by the media and made a lot of noise in Victorian society. Journalists, writers, and amateur detectives offered their theories about who commits these crimes. Most of these theories were not and could not be taken seriously. For example, at the time of the murders, the famous actor Richard Mansfield was playing in a theatrical production of Robert Louis Stevenson's book The Strange Story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Moreover, he played the villain so convincingly that some journalists thought that Mansfield was Jack the Ripper. William Henry Barry fled to Dundee from the East End after he killed his wife Ellen Elliot, a former prostitute, on February 4, 1889. Barry was checked by the police for communication with other victims, but denied his guilt, confessing only to the murder of his wife. On the 24th of April, 1889, Barry was hanged in Dundee. The executioner James Barry assumed that Barry was Jack the Ripper. He became the last criminal executed by the verdict of the court in Dundee. Thomas Neil Crim, a British serial poisoner, was sentenced to hang after the murders of 5 people. The famous executioner James Billington, who hanged Crim, claimed that on the way to the scaffold, the killer said, "I'm Jack." For many years after the murders, various versions were put forward. The suspects included almost everyone who was somehow connected with the case, as well as many well-known names that were not considered at all in the police investigation. Since the versions were put forward when no one involved in the investigation remained alive, the authors of the theory could accuse anyone, without the need for any supporting historical evidence. Many versions were so absurd that no one took them seriously. So, the writer George Gissing, Prime Minister William Gladstone, and artist Frank Miles, Duke of Clarence, were named as possible murderers in 1962. Rumors spread in the press that Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, the eldest son of the Prince of Wales, may have been involved in the murders of Jack the Ripper, or was him. Later, there were allegations, in particular in the book Stephen Knight, that Albert Victor had a baby, and the women from Whitechapel and either he himself or several high-ranking men committed murder in order to hide it. This version was repeated several times, but the researchers rejected it as untenable, and referred to the indisputable evidence of the prince's innocence. For example, on September 30th, 1888, when Elizabeth Straight and Catherine Eddowes were killed in London, Albert Victor was more than 500 miles from the capital. He stayed at the Balmoral royal residence in Scotland, where he was seen by Queen Victoria, other family members of the German royal family visiting the country, and a large number of staff. According to the official court circular, family diaries and letters, newspaper reports, and other sources, Eddie couldn't have been anywhere near the places where the other murders were committed. Jack the Ripper is one of the most mysterious personalities in history. Disputes about his identity are still going on. It is unclear who he was, how many people he killed in the end, and most importantly, why did he kill?